Do you want to reimagine one of the most incredible campaigns of World War II? Are you looking for an engaging version of Axis and Allies that you can actually finish in an afternoon? Do you want to pull out your new game and get playing instead of spending hours poring over a rulebook? Well, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Board Game Nation How to Play Guide and Rulebook Companion for the brand new Axis and Allies North Africa by Renegade Game Studios. Grab your sunscreen and your favorite adventure hat. We're heading for the desert. Let's make it hot. Welcome to Board Game Nation. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. And a special thank you to our friends at Renegade Game Studios for sponsoring today's video. Follow the link in the description to see where you can get your copy of not just this great game, but the whole catalog of Axis and Allies games, accessories, and so much more. This game has a lot going on, and in this video, we're going to cover all of it. You're almost certainly going to want to bookmark this video, though, so that you can reference it as you're playing through your first game or two. Now, in the interest of teaching the game effectively, we're going to jump around in the rulebook rather than going page by page. But for reference, we'll add a little graphic like this one with a page number of the relevant sections of the rulebook as we go. We'll also be using slightly different terminology than you might find in the rulebook, so watch for that. Now, I suggest watching this entire video all the way through once. After that, you can use the chapter guide to jump to any sections that you want to revisit. But this is also a choose-your-own-adventure video. Occasionally, to maintain a train of thought, I'm going to put off talking about a particular topic until later. For those looking for information about that specific topic immediately, we'll add a little timestamp, like this, that you can use to jump to, well, later. Arabic is not my native language. As such, I seriously doubt that I'll get all the pronunciations of the names and cities and territories right every time. I promise my best efforts, and I thank you in advance for your forgiveness. Don't at me, J-Lo. Now, you might have been playing Axis and Allies since the era of big hair bands, but as they say, this is not your father's Axis and Allies. Larry Harris and Matt Hyra have teamed up to bring us a whole new adventure. North Africa has loads of different units, along with some units that we'll recognize from previous games, but that might have different abilities. Now, it's fair to say that this game leans heavily into supplies and logistics, but more than that, how units enter the game is different, territorial control terms are different, and even the win conditions are very different than any of the main Axis and Allies games. Just something to keep in mind before you start skipping ahead. Oh, and no more six-sided dice. In this game, you'll be testing your mettle with D10s. All right, let's get into it. Here are the basics. Axis and Allies North Africa is a World War II era strategy game for 2 to 4 players, ages 12 and up, and players familiar with the rules can get in a game in 3 to 5 hours. Players take on the role of the Axis powers of Germany and Italy, or the Allied powers of the United Kingdom and the United States in the struggle for control of North Africa. This game offers a choice of 2 very different scenarios. Rommel's Last Push starts the game in round 1 and has the US enter the campaign in the 7th round. This scenario is best for games with 2 or 3 people. For a shorter game, players can select Operation Torch. This scenario starts in round 7 as the US enters the battle and is a better fit for 4 players. We're going to set up Rommel's Last Push to get you up to speed on the basics. Towards the end of the video, we'll talk more about the Operation Torch scenario. Now, we've just completed an unboxing video for this game. It has a detailed look at what comes in the box and all of the pieces. You'll find that linked in the description and in the card above. To get this game started, let's get the board on the table. The map in Axis and Allies North Africa is broken into land spaces called territories, islands, and sea zones. Each territory and island has a name, and each sea zone has a number. Also, some sea zones are convoy zones. Now, we're going to be talking a lot more about those later, but for now, know that I break convoy zones into 2 types, numbered and unnumbered. The numbered convoy zones can be entered by any sea or air unit, but these unnumbered convoy zones are only used by the UK and have special rules. All of the numbered convoy zones are named for their corresponding landing territories. These land territories can also be called ports or port cities. Unnamed islands are just decorative and can't be interacted with in any way. Now, for game purposes, Gibraltar is also considered an island. Malta and Gibraltar also have circles around them. This is to help players show which units are on the island and which are in the surrounding sea zone. Other than that, they don't affect the game in any way. So, to be clear, everything inside the black circle is the island. The waters shown inside those circles are not separate sea zones and cannot be entered by sea units, meaning that the island of Malta is directly adjacent to the Malta convoy zone, and Gibraltar is directly adjacent to Sea Zone 3. But despite this slight overlap of lines, Gibraltar is not adjacent to Sea Zone 1. Territories with this stripy pattern are impassable by any units for a variety of reasons. Sahara Desert territories are differentiated by this waves of sand pattern. These are also impassable except by scout cars. Yeah, scout cars. I told you, this is a very different game. This red line that stretches the length of the map is the coast road, and it speeds up the movement of some land units. However, Spanish Morocco is impassable, so units will need to go around it instead of using the road to go through it. As we look at the different types of land territories, there's a few key concepts we need to make clear straight away. All territories exist in one of three conditions: friendly, hostile, or neutral. A friendly territory contains a control marker and/or combat units owned by that power or an ally. A hostile territory contains an enemy control marker and/or combat units owned by an enemy power. Lastly, a neutral territory contains no control markers nor combat units. Oh, and when you hear combat units, that means all the units except for trucks. Trucks are the only non-combat unit in this game. Some of the land territories have a number with a circle around it. This is important for a number of reasons. First, these territories generate reinforcement points for their controller at the start of their turn. Second, these territories are the only spaces on the entire map that can be controlled. That's going to be a really important vocabulary word in this game, so I'll repeat. Land territories with a circled number in them are the only ones that can ever be controlled. That means that Constantine can never be controlled, but Algiers and Oran can. The only exceptions to this are the land territories that have a control marker pre-printed on the map like Gibraltar, Malta, Sicily, etc. These named islands cannot be attacked by land units, and therefore will always be controlled by their original power. Now, of course, territories without production values can be occupied by land units, but they can never be controlled. Being aware of which territories can be controlled and which ones cannot is very important in this game, so hang on to that. You'll notice that some, but not all, of the territories contain some smaller text under the area's name. You're going to want to make sure that you're aware of what that text says, what it means, and to keep those details in mind throughout the game. First, land territories in this game have strictly enforced stacking limits. The default maximum number of combat, air, and land units that can end a phase in the same territory is 8. Some territories have stacking limits that are higher and lower than the standard 8 units. If that's the case, the stacking limit for that territory is represented by SL on the board. For example, Tunis has a stacking limit of 13, while Gibraltar has a max of only 2. We've got a section later in the video that talks about stacking limits in a lot more detail. In contrast to land territories, sea zones can never be controlled by either side and have no stacking limits. Sea zones are simply either friendly or hostile. Friendly sea zones don't have enemy surface warships or air units, whereas hostile sea zones do contain enemy surface warships or air units. All sea zones and straits are accessible by both sides, even if you see an enemy marker in them. There are 2 exceptions here. The Suez Canal is closed to the Axis powers, so they can't head south from Sea Zone 31. And the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily is only accessible by the Axis. Now, this is going to look a little strange, but land units will be entering the map via convoy zones. More about this when we discuss convoy zones and deploying reinforcements, but you'll be seeing this kind of thing on a regular basis. However, the inverse is not true. Sea units can never enter a land territory. Now, other than during the setup process, land and air units and supplies will all be entering via these convoy zones. Sea units will be deployed into sea zones with the sea unit silhouettes, specifically sea zones 1, 2, 3, 10, and the Atlantic convoy zone. Also note that these deployment zones are country specific. So the Americans will only ever be deploying sea units into Sea Zone 2, the Germans into Sea Zone 1, you get the idea. When players purchase new units in the Requisition reinforcements phase, with a few exceptions, those units will be placed in the big rectangle at the bottom left of the map. The top right of the map has some helpful tools. The first tool is a round tracker which goes up to 14, starting at round 1 for Rommel's last push and round 7 if you're playing Operation Torch. You'll also find the national basic reinforcement points and the order of play. Now, the order of play, of course, is pretty self-explanatory, but we'll be talking more about the basic reinforcement points later. Finally, the phase sequence is also shown here as well, and this will be a helpful reference throughout the game. And those are the basics of the map. Let's get this game set up and ready for action. First, you need to decide who's going to play which power. You can do this however you want, of course, flip a coin, draw markers, whatever, but I prefer the optional bidding method that's on page 38 of the rulebook. This is also what's used in tournaments, but it's up to you. If you're interested, a link to a video that explains how bidding works and the full current tournament rules will be linked in the description below. Once you've got all that sorted out, have the players controlling Germany and Italy sit on the north side of the map, and the US and the Britons sit on the south. Place the round tracker on the board in the place appropriate for the scenario that your group has selected. Give each player their power setup charts, the inventory of their plastic miniatures, sea mines, and the national control markers for their power. The double-sided reference charts, supply tokens, landmine tokens, dice, and plastic chips are the shared inventory and should be placed in a spot easily accessible for all players. The setup for the board is shown on the power setup charts. The power setup charts are double-sided, so make sure that everyone is using this side for the scenario that everyone has agreed to play. Next, players place the units in the sea zones and land territories listed on their cards. To help keep the board clean and the action easier to manage, the game comes with green and gray stacking chips. For clarity, each mini is 1 unit. A gray chip under a mini represents 1 additional unit of the same type, and the green chips represent 3 additional units of that same type. So a guy on the map is just 1 guy. A guy with a gray chip under him equals 2 guys. A guy with a green chip under him equals 4 guys. You get the idea. However, and this is super important, the number of game pieces in a player's inventory or in the shared inventory is strictly limited to the number of physical pieces that come in their resealable bags. For reference, there's also a list on the left side of page 5 in the rulebook. But what's more, none of the air units, sea units, trucks, land or sea mines, or supply tokens can ever be represented on the board by plastic chips. These units can never be chipped up. Now these are the only ones that may be represented by chips. Also, the number of stacks of each unit type are limited by the number of units listed on the left side of page 5. So the Italians can have stacks of AA guns if they want, but they can never be in more than 4 different places on the board. And that includes the convoy zones and the reinforcement zones. Even the green and gray stacking chips themselves are limited to the actual number of components that came in the box. As a result, the total number of units available to everyone is limited by this combination of their plastic pieces and the chips. Now, this also means that you're going to want to keep this game intact. No mixing pieces or chips from other games into this box. Well, here's some good news. Whenever a piece or token is removed from play for any reason, it just returns to the player's inventory or the shared inventory as appropriate. The game does come with a bag of spare units. Now, these can be replacement pieces if you want them to, or if you want to make your own homegrown scenarios, you can absolutely do that. You want the French to have trucks or the Americans to have scout cars, here you go. But none of these pieces should be included if you're planning to play either of the 2 scenarios laid out in the rulebook. For that reason, I suggest keeping them in the sealed bag that they came in until you need them. A few quick notes about setup. If you're playing the Rommel's last push scenario, Italy and Germany each start with only 1 truck available to each of them. The Italians' truck starts the game in Tripoli, but the Germans' only truck starts in their inventory. Their other trucks will become available in round 7. To avoid confusion, I suggest placing the 2 trucks in waiting on the round tracker on round 7. This will keep them from accidentally moving into play or from being forgotten when the time comes for them to get into the action. Next, the German setup charts list the Vichy French. Now these are the blue guys, they're packaged separately, and you can set them up now, but they don't move or attack or really do anything until round 7. Over to the UK. You'll notice the UK setup chart says variable initial reinforcements when talking about the convoy zones in the bottom right of the map. This is the Allies' first strategic choice of the game. During setup, the UK player gets 12 reinforcement points per convoy zone to purchase any combat units for their normal costs and place them in these convoy zones. Now they can only purchase combat units, so no trucks, no mines, no supplies. The UK can buy anything that they want during their turn and deploy them into these convoy zones. They just can't use these variable initial reinforcement points to buy any non-combat units or supplies during this setup portion of the show. Now, the best strategic options for the UK here is a conversation for a different video. And more about all this later, but here's what you need to know to get the game set up. In phase 1 of each player's turn, they'll advance convoys, meaning that the land and air units that are placed in the Suez Canal during setup will advance into Cairo on the UK's first turn. Any sea units in the Suez would move north into Sea Zone 31. Then, as the arrows indicate, the units in the Indian Ocean convoy move into the Suez, the Atlantic into the Indian. So what the UK is really doing here is they're placing their reinforcement orders in London, but it's going to take whatever it is that they ordered 3 full turns for it to make it around the Horn of Africa all the way up to reach Cairo. Now, the upside is that these convoy zones can't be attacked, or for that matter, even entered by any units other than the units that are convoying through them. One last quick note about the setup for the UK. At the end of round 4, the US Lend-Lease program kicks in. This is represented by 2 UK Sherman tanks being added to the Atlantic Ocean convoy zone. Again, I suggest that during setup, the UK player go ahead and place those Sherman tanks on the round tracker on the round 4 spot as a reminder. So in less than 10 minutes of everyone placing their own units for Rommel's last push, you should be able to go from this to this. Ooh. With the game set up and ready for action, let's start with a quick overview of how this game flows, and then we'll break each step down with more detail. Not surprisingly, Germany starts the action, followed by the United Kingdom and then Italy. These 3 powers will duke it out alone until the Americans finally decide to get in the action in round 7. Each power's turn consists of 6 phases. 1. Advance convoys. 2. Requisition reinforcements. 3. Combat move and attack declaration. 4. Conduct combat. 5, non-combat move, and finally 6, deploy reinforcements and assign convoy escorts. During the Advanced Convoys phase, players must attempt to move any land units and supplies in convoy zones to their corresponding ports. Air units coming out of convoy zones have 2 free moves to find a safe place to land as they stage for their combat and non-combat moves later in the turn. And, as we mentioned before, during the UK player's turn, they move any units and supplies forward 1 spot into the next convoy zone as they make the long trek around the Cape of Good Hope. Once all the convoys have advanced, it's time to requisition reinforcements. Here players count all the numbers in the territories that they control that have a reinforcement point value, and then add that total to their national basic reinforcement points from the chart at the top right of the map. That total is their available reinforcement points, or RPs for short. Players spend these RPs to buy supplies, units, land, and sea mines. Most of the newly purchased units and supplies are placed into the reinforcement zone, but we'll discuss exceptions to that when we dive deeper into Phase 2. Also, the special rules around Malta here are a whole thing that we're going to be talking about later. Next, it's time for players to make their combat moves and attack declarations. Here, units can be moved into their attack positions and declare an attack on their opponents. In the conduct combat phase, all of the declared combats are resolved. After resolving combat, the non-combat move phase allows all units that did not make a combat move to reposition, and air units to use their remaining movements to land. Scout cars are also able to use their remaining movements during this phase, unless, of course, they were destroyed in combat or hit a mine earlier. The final phase of each player's turn is deploy reinforcements and assign convoy escorts. Now those shiny new units purchased earlier move out of the reinforcement zone and into the fray. Sea units are deployed into the sea unit deployment zones for their respective country. Land and air units and supplies can be deployed into staging zones. That's Italy for either of the Axis powers and Gibraltar for the UK. Or they can deploy directly into open convoy zones. Now the Americans don't have a staging area for deployment, so they only have the convoy zone deployment option. During this phase, players may move any air units that did not make a combat or non-combat move up to 2 spaces into an open convoy zone to protect any units deployed there. Now, if you've deployed units into a sea zone that is hostile in this phase, no combat will result between those units until the other player's turn. After that last phase is complete, the action moves to the next player in order. Make sure to also move the round tracker at the end of each round of play. Now, play continues in this fashion until the victory conditions are met. What are the victory conditions? I'm glad you asked. Axis and Allies North Africa has a number of different win conditions and types of victory. Teams can win instantly by clearing all of the North Africa land territories of all enemy combat units, or by capturing the enemy regional capitals of Cairo or Tunis. If none of that has happened by the end of round 14, the game ends and the players are awarded a total, major, or minor victory, depending on the chosen scenario and as determined by this chart. If both sides earn a minor victory or neither side has met any of the victory conditions, the game ends in a draw. Now, if you're like me and detest the idea of going home without a winner, and you're willing to do some accounting, as a tiebreaker you can add up the reinforcement point values of all of the land units in the territories, and the side with the higher total is your winner. Okay, I know that sounds like a lot, but this game does run really smoothly once you get the hang of it. Let's go to the map and get this game underway. Now, we're going to get started from the very beginning of Rommel's last push. In this scenario, the Americans have not yet entered the war. No one may cross the white line and enter Tunisia, Algeria, or Morocco. And the Axis only have access to 1 truck each. A number of things are going to happen in rounds 4, 7, and 8, but we'll get to that later. For now, it's time for Rommel's last push. Like we talked about during the setup, the UK is able to load up the convoy zones coming from London around Africa. They can place up to 12 RPs worth of combat units in each of the following convoy zones: the Suez Canal, the Indian Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean. For our game, let's say that the UK player decides to place a destroyer, an artillery in the Suez, a Matilda tank and a scout car, and an infantry in each of the Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean convoys. That's 12 RPs each. Oh, and this is probably a good time to remind everyone that this is not a strategy video. The moves in these examples are chosen to best demonstrate the rules of the game. While I'll try not to make any outright blunders, please don't look at this video for any kind of hidden strategic gems. If you'd like to see strategy videos for this game from Board Game Nation, let us know in the comments. Once all the setup is complete and the UK has decided what it wants for Christmas 3 turns from now, the game begins. Each turn begins with Phase 1, Advanced Convoys. Here, at the beginning of Round 1, the Germans don't have any units in their only open convoy zone in Sea Zone 13, so there's nothing for them to do here. But here's the gist of it. In this phase, land units and supply tokens that were deployed into numbered sea zones by the active player in their previous turn move into their corresponding land territories. Now, once supply tokens make it to land, they're not country specific, but they only advance on the turn of the power that purchased them. So to keep them from getting mixed up, it's helpful to mark supply tokens in convoy zones with control markers of the powers that bought them. If land units can't move into their respective land territories because of stacking limits, the units stay in their convoy zone, and if they survive there for another round, they'll advance to their corresponding port on future turns. If a convoy zone has units or supplies in it and the correlating land territory has become enemy controlled, the land units and supplies are moved back to the reinforcement zone during this phase, not when that port territory was captured. And land units and supplies must be redeployed as normal during the deploy reinforcements phase. But no matter the state of the port city, air units in these zones have 2 free moves to find a friendly controlled land territory to safely land. If the incoming air units cannot find a safe place to land by the end of the advanced convoy phase, they're destroyed. When that's done, we move on to Phase 2, Requisition Reinforcements. In this phase, players total and spend reinforcement points to buy mines, units, and supplies. Players total the values in the territories they control with the circled numbers. Players add that number to their national basic reinforcement points, shown at the top right corner of the board. This combined number is the total available RPs for that player's turn. With some caveats, players can spend them however they'd like, but RPs can never be saved. Any unspent RPs are lost. So the Germans start the game controlling, well, nothing, but they still get their basic income of 25 reinforcement points. Then they consult their power-specific reference charts to decide what they'd like to purchase. Right about now is probably when you're noticing that the unit costs and abilities for the various powers are different. Yeah, the German infantry costs more than the Italians, but the German guys have a better defense value. Those teeny tiny UK scout cars can move 4 spaces, while the Axis scout cars can only move 3, and the US doesn't have scout cars at all. There are lots of these kinds of asynchronous differences in the game, so you're going to want to keep that player aid close by. And when deciding what to purchase, it's important to remember that supplies and mines, as well as air, sea, and truck units, are limited to the pieces in the appropriate inventory and cannot be stacked on gray or green stacking chips. So, if the UK already has 2 battleships on the map, that means that they don't have a mini to place in the reinforcement zone, so they can't buy one. Here's a few other restrictions on purchasing. While the Americans will be giving the UK 2 Sherman tanks at the end of round 4 through the Lend-Lease program, those are the only 2 Shermans they'll ever get. The UK can never purchase Shermans, and the US can't buy any more for them. The Germans, the Italians, and the UK can buy a maximum of 5 supply tokens each turn. When the Americans show up in round 7, they can buy 10 supply tokens per turn. Once a player has decided what they want to requisition, not everything that they ordered will go into the reinforcement zone. Some things will go directly into the fight. These units are immediately deployed onto the board in Phase 2. Free French units, German subs, and land and sea mines. Let's talk about each of those briefly in order. This won't come up until after round 7, and we're going to talk more about how the Vichy French become the Free French later, but if there are Free French and the US controls Iran, they can requisition one of each of the Free French unit types and deploy them directly to Iran. Now, contrary to what the name might suggest, these units aren't actually free. They must be paid for by the Americans in Phase 2, but in that same phase, they get to deploy them immediately to Iran. So that's handy. I mean, maybe they'll bring baguettes or something, I don't know. German submarines are considered elite units. As such, they're deployed directly into Sea Zone 1 in Phase 2, and that's just north of the Casablanca Sea Zone. Plus, their eliteness allows them to attack in the same turn that they're deployed, so the Americans ignore this ability at their peril. Time to talk about how and when mines are deployed. We'll talk about how and when they go boom when we get to combat. Let's start with landmines. Landmines cost 1 reinforcement point each, and players can deploy 1 landmine per turn per territory into any territories that they control or that contain their combat units. Note that mines are placed specifically on 1 territorial border and that they won't impact the other borders. Now, players can place as many landmines as they want in a territory, and they can mine all of the borders in a territory, but they can only place 1 mine per turn per territory, and they have to control it or occupy it with combat units in order to do so. Also, when you look closely at the landmine tokens, you'll see that they aren't country-specific because in certain circumstances they can be captured. Also, they're double-sided. One side has 1 mine, the other has 2. So you can use these however you'd like. But when it comes time to blow them up, all that will matter is the total number of mines, not exactly how many tokens there are and how they're broken up. The tokens for sea mines, on the other hand, are country-specific, and they deploy differently than landmines. Sea mines cost 2 reinforcement points, and players can deploy 1 sea mine per sea zone per turn in as many sea zones as they'd like following these restrictions. The sea zone cannot contain enemy combat sea units and can't be an enemy sea unit deployment zone. So the Allies cannot deploy sea mines to sea zones 1 or 10, and the Axis can't deploy sea mines into sea zones 2, 3, 31, nor any of the convoy zones that are south of 31. However, unlike landmines, sea mines occupy the entire sea zone, not just the border. So you can place them anywhere in the zone that you want, and they'll work the same when the time comes. One last note about placing mines. Remember that the game comes with a specific amount of land and sea mine tokens. If these are all in play, you can't buy any more. Now, the tokens for landmines are generic, but the sea mine tokens are double-sided with tokens for each team. Now, the Allies only have 6 sea mine tokens, and the Axis have 9 of them, so that's interesting. During the Requisition Reinforcements phase, the UK can also repair damaged battleships that are in Sea Zone 31 by spending 1 supply token. Now, that supply token must be taken from Cairo, and Cairo is the only Allied port, actually the only shipyard in the game, so this is the only place that battleships can be repaired. Oh, and I see you looking at the 15 with the funny-looking asterisks on Malta. First, you heathen, that's not an asterisk, that is the Maltese cross, but for today, you're forgiven, because here it's kind of both. The island of Malta and its convoy zone have a bag of special rules that only apply to these 2 spaces. Here we go. Like other islands, Malta can never be invaded by land units, but it can and will be attacked by air units repeatedly. The only land unit that can be deployed to the Malta convoy zone and hope to advance to Malta is the AA gun. And Malta has a stacking limit of 3. In addition, Malta is also limited to a max of 3 supply tokens. Not 3 5 supply tokens, 3 supply tokens. So to recap, the UK can have a max of 3 units. These can be any mix of AA guns, fighters, and bombers, but there can only ever be 3 of them at any given time on the island, and there can only be a max of 3 supply tokens on the island. Now, if the UK wants to collect 15 reinforcement points in Phase 2 of their turn, they must spend 1 supply token, and it must come from the island of Malta. If they aren't able or choose not to, the UK collects nothing from the island of Malta. Now, that might sound like a lot of effort for 15 RPs, but 15 RPs goes a long way in this game, so it's something to think about. Back to our game. Germany has 25 reinforcement points to spend, and they're feeling itchy. They decide to buy a submarine, a sea mine, 2 landmines, 5 supply, a scout car, a tank, and their one and only truck. The sub is immediately deployed into the German deployment zone in Sea Zone 1. They want to slow down the British Navy that's amassing in Sea Zone 31, so they deploy a sea mine in Sea Zone 29. Now, they would love to place both landmines in El Agheila, but they can only place 1 in each territory per turn, so they place 1 on the border between El Agheila and Mersabrega, and the other on the border of Zella and Mersabrega. This works because the Germans have combat land units in Zella and El Agheila. The 5 supply token, the truck, the tank, and the scout car are all placed in the reinforcement zone for later deployment. Before we get into combat, we need to talk a bit about how and when units move around the map in this game. In Axis and Allies North Africa, there are 2 types of movements. Well, 2.5, maybe 3. The most common are the combat moves in Phase 3 and non-combat move in Phase 5. The other kind of move that I'm calling kind of a half move is the movement of air units into and out of convoy zones that happens in Phase 6 and in Phase 1. Remember that in Phase 1, advanced convoys, that air units have those 2 free moves to find a friendly place to land? Well, in Phase 6, we assign convoy escorts, and it's a similar kind of thing that's going to happen there, but in reverse. We'll talk more about assigning convoy escorts when we get there, but for now, know this. The moves that an air unit makes during the advanced convoy phase do not count towards their total movement points for the turn. So basically, air units have those 2 moves to get out of their convoy zones to a landing field, and from there, they still have their full complement of movement points for the rest of the turn. As for combat moves, each unit has their movement listed on the reference charts, as well as any special abilities. Now, as you can see, there's a bunch of them. We're going to circle back to cover all of those special abilities later, but for now, we'll cover them as they come up in our examples. All units moving in Phase 3 must end in their attack position and must attack their target on Phase 4. If they aren't doing this, then it's not a combat move, and it has to wait until Phase 5. Another big vocabulary word here, attack position. The rulebook uses a lot of ink to explain this, but here's the easiest way to say it. The attack position of any unit is where it will be firing from. Now, like most other Axis and Allies games, the attack position of all sea units and air units is in the same sea zone or land territory with those enemy units. They steam into the sea zone, they fly over the territories, where they try to take care of business. So their attack positions are in the same space as the enemy units. Land units in this game work differently. Land units will be attacking and defending at the borders between the territories. Meaning, in order to declare an attack, land units must be in an adjacent territory with enough movement points available to them to attempt to cross the border. Basically, the final combat move of land units is to use 1 final movement point to declare an attack and move to, but not over, the border they want to cross. If any or all of the attacking units decide not to continue the attack, run out of supplies, or fail to defeat the enemy units, they will remain in the territory that they were attacking from. Again, attacking land units are fighting at the border. They don't actually enter a territory unless they are part of an attacking force that actually destroys all of the enemy combat units in the territory or the defending units retreat. In that case, all of the victorious attacking units are compelled to enter the newly won territory up to that territory's stacking limit. Oh yeah, defending units can retreat, but we'll come back to that. So here's the punchline. Air units and sea units are in their attack position when they're in the same space as the units they're attacking. Land units are in their attack position when they're in a territory adjacent to a territory that they're attacking, and they have at least one movement point available to get them to the border. Supplies and the logistics of having them in the right place at the right time is a critical aspect of this game because most land units require supplies to conduct combat and to defend. So, to be considered in attack position, they must also have access to the requisite number of supply tokens. Following the basic movement rules and stacking limits, players can move as many land units as they want to get into a fight. They can start as many fights in as many territories as they like, as long as the attacking forces end Phase 3 in their attack position and they have the necessary supplies to conduct the attack. Good news is that these supplies can be drawn from the territory the units are attacking from, or from any adjacent friendly or neutral territory. So how many supplies are necessary? Here's the mnemonic device that I've been using to help me remember. For each round of combat that I want to conduct with land units, I need 151. To conduct a round of combat, I need one supply for up to 5 land units attacking from one territory to another. 151. Do you have 6 land units that you want to attack with? Then you'll need 2 supply tokens, or you can leave one of those units out of the attack. Do you have 2 land units declaring attacks from a territory, and 2 land units declaring an attack on the same territory but from a different adjacent territory? You need 2 supplies. Do you have 4 land units in a territory and you want to attack in 2 different directions? You need 2 supplies. But here's some more good news. All the air units, sea units, and scout cars do not require supplies to attack, so don't count them when sorting out how many supplies you're going to need. Also, scout cars have a whole set of abilities that we're going to cover later. The tanks with a movement value of 2 have a special ability called Blitz. They can use their first movement point to enter an adjacent hostile territory containing no enemy combat units and immediately take control of it if it's a controllable territory. Because this move does not require combat, no supplies are needed. Tanks can use their second move to move back to where they came from, to another adjacent territory with no enemy units, or they may declare an attack on a hostile adjacent land territory. If they declare an attack that will require engaging with enemy units, they will be needing those pesky supplies, and those supplies will need to be in reach of their attack position. No matter what they do, if they enter a hostile territory on their first or second move, this is a combat move, so they can't move again during the non-combat phase. About the supply tokens, there's a few things to keep in mind. While supplies aren't needed by air or sea units, most land units need them to attack and defend. Land units can make non-combat moves without supplies, but if they're going to get into a fight, they're almost certainly going to need supplies. The physical tokens come in 2 varieties, 1 supply and 5 supply, and can be purchased as such. Once they've been deployed into a convoy zone or land territory, you can break up the 5 supply tokens as needed, but you can't break up a 5 supply token while it's still in the reinforcement zone or while it is being deployed. If you bought a 5 supply token at the start of your turn, you have to deploy it that way. Supply tokens can never be voluntarily destroyed, and they can only be moved with trucks and convoy zones. Supply tokens are not owned by any individual power. Supply tokens in a land territory controlled by or containing combat units can be moved or used by either power of the controlling or occupying team. Supply tokens in a neutral or unoccupied territories are free to go home and can be used from an adjacent territory or moved by a truck of any power. When supply tokens are deployed into a convoy zone, they should be marked with a control marker to denote ownership, so that they'll advance to their landing zone during the correct power's turn. Let's take a closer look at air units. All of the various powers' fighters have the same movement points and attack and defense values, but the bomber stats vary by country, so check the reference charts for the differences. Now, except for the Saharan desert territories, air units can fly over any passable land territory and any numbered sea zone. Islands are land territories and are separate from the surrounding sea zones, meaning that flying onto an island from a sea zone costs 1 movement point and vice versa. All air units can move in the combat and non-combat movement phase, but they must have a safe place to land in the non-combat phase that was controlled by a friendly power at the start of their turn. So air units use movement points to get to a fight, but they have to save enough to find a place to land when the smoke clears. There are no kamikazes in this game, so air units cannot intentionally be moved out of range of a safe landing area. Also, and this is really important, air units can only land in controlled territories. And remember, the only controllable territories are the ones with reinforcement points, or that came stamped with a national control marker at the start of the game. So, air units can never land in places like Sirte or Mersa Matruh or Constantine, but they can land in places like Benghazi and Merith and Sicily. This is easy to overlook, so watch for it carefully. All bombers also have an ability called collateral damage. The German Stuka bomber has its own very special ability called targeted attack, but we'll come back to that when we cover all the special abilities. Let's head out to sea and take a look at the naval units in this game. Each power in Axis and Allies North Africa has their own set of sea units, but when they do have units in common, all the stats and abilities for those units are the same. This game features submarines, destroyers, and the UK has the ability to build the mighty battleship. If you played Axis and Allies 1940 Europe or Pacific or 1942 2nd Edition, the rules here for sea units are nearly identical. Subs and destroyers will work the same way, but battleships lack the offshore bombardment ability, and that'll make sense when we talk about transports. All sea units can move up to 4 spaces, but must stop when entering a hostile sea zone. Submarines have a number of cool guy abilities, not the least of which is their ability to treat hostile sea zones as friendly, allowing them to continue movement through hostile sea zones. Conversely, a sub or subs by themselves don't make a sea zone hostile to enemy sea units. While subs can never hit enemy air units, they also can't be hit by enemy air units. In Step 1 of the combat sequence, when attacking or defending, submarines will have to choose to submerge or surprise attack. If they submerge, they are removed from combat for the rest of this battle but remain in the same sea zone. If they surprise attack, they'll attack in Step 1 of combat. Any units destroyed by these hits are removed immediately from play and will not get to fire later in the round. Now, all of that is true unless the opponent has a destroyer present. Destroyers are the anti-submarine vessel. Subs lose all of those ability if there's an enemy destroyer present in the same sea zone at the start of a round of combat. Any enemy destroyer will stop the movement of subs. If an enemy destroyer is present at the start of a round of combat, subs take no action in Step 1 and they can be hit by enemy air units. One thing here, if a player is attacking an enemy sub that's in the same sea zone as the destroyer of a friendly power, the enemy sub does not lose its abilities. The attacking player must have a destroyer of their own in the fight to cancel the defending sub's ability. However, if a multinational group of sea units comes under attack, they're all under attack. So the defending destroyer would cancel the abilities of the attacking subs. The UK battleship takes 2 hits to sink. When it takes its first hit, tip it on its side, like so. Damage to these big boys can only be repaired in the Requisition reinforcements phase of the UK's turn, and it can only do so in the shipyard in Sea Zone 31. The cost is 1 supply token, and it must come from Cairo. You can't move around a war zone without worrying about mines blowing up. So let's talk about how that works. First, air units can never trigger a mine of any sort. This honor is left exclusively to land and sea units, and once placed, mines can never move. As for how mines are triggered, it's basically what you'd expect, but with a bit of a twist. If a sea unit enters or is deployed into a sea zone with an enemy sea mine, or if a land unit attempts to cross a border with a landmine on it, the defending player gets to decide how many of those now triggered mines they want to detonate. They can detonate all, some, or none. It's totally up to them. Now, ownership of sea mine is obvious. It's controlled by the power as marked. Landmines are controlled by the power that controls the territory that the mine is in. If it's a neutral, the power with the most combat units in the mined territory is responsible for them. If there's a tie, they have to agree on the number of mines detonated. If they can't agree, the lower number is chosen. It's possible, even common, for control of landmines to change hands, even sides. If a landmine is in a neutral territory with no enemy combat units in it, the landmines there cannot be triggered because they are no longer owned by anyone and can be captured simply by occupying the territory with a combat unit. So what happens when one of these little boxes of death decides to go boom? Let's start with landmines. After all of the attacks have been declared, the landmines controller decides how many mines they're going to detonate and where. For each territory, follow this sequence. First, update the number of mine tokens on that border to reflect the reduced amount. Now, the player that owns the mines rolls 3 dice for each detonating mine all at the same time. Each roll of a 3 or less is a hit. For each hit, the attacking player must remove 1 unit from the battle, not from play, just the battle. The unit remains in the territory it was attacking from. It doesn't participate in the rest of the battle, and it can't move during the non-combat phase, but it will be right as rain at the end of the turn. You can turn it on its side or move it back to show that it isn't part of the combat anymore. Just be careful not to confuse it with any of the attacking units or any units that are in the territory but didn't attack. Tanks can blitz over borders with landmines, but the player controlling those mines can choose to detonate them as they try to cross. If they score a hit, and the tank fails to cross the mined border and remains in the territory it was trying to leave. Any units that weren't hit by the landmine blast can continue moving as normal. Now, regardless of how many land units got turned back by mines, the rest of the force that's been declared as attacking must continue the fight for at least one round of combat. Sea mines work differently and are even more deadly. Now, sea mines don't make a sea zone hostile, so enemy sea units aren't stopped by their presence, but when they enter waters with sea mines, the sea mines are triggered. Units enter sea zones in three ways. They either make a combat move, a non-combat move, or they're deployed into a convoy zone. If they are a sea unit entering a sea zone with a mine to do combat or just passing through, enemy sea units must pause in them long enough for the owner of that sea mine to decide if they're going to detonate it. If the owner decides to make the big boom, they decide how many mines they wish to detonate and roll one die for each mine they're detonating at the same time. Each die will score a hit with a roll of a 3 or less. Now, with sea mines, a hit is a hit, and it must immediately be assigned by the controller of the encroaching sea units. Remember, an undamaged UK battleship takes 2 hits to sink. Any sea units that survive the sea mine extravaganza continue as normal. If they still have movement available to them and they didn't do combat in that sea zone, they can continue to move as if they didn't almost get sunk by a floaty, spiky beach ball of death. The second way sea units enter a sea zone is through deployment into a numbered convoy zone. You can place sea mines in numbered enemy convoy zones that don't contain enemy ships or silhouettes of enemy ships, and it is a particularly nasty move. We'll talk about how those incoming units deal with sea mines when we talk about sea combat in just a minute. Let's see if we can sum up the timing of all of this. Now, here's how I think about combat moves on land and sea. When the combat move phase starts, all of the units that want to make a combat move this turn will try to move to their attack position. But their combat move can be interrupted if they encounter an enemy sea mine in a sea zone that they've entered, or if they try to cross a territorial border with an enemy-controlled landmine. So, after all the combat units that have wanted to get into a fight this turn have arrived in their various attack positions, or are engaged with a mine, the defending player chooses how many mines, if any, to detonate. The defender can do this in any order that they choose, one triggered mine or mines at a time. Then, after however many mines have been detonated, and any hits assigned or not, surviving units must now continue their movement until they reach their attack position. Now, key point here. If a unit wasn't moving before any mines went boom, they can't start moving now. So, would-be attacking units can't send their gullible buddy forward first and hang out and see what happens. If units are going to make a combat move, they have to start moving when everyone else does. If, while continuing on their merry way to their attack position, these combat-bound units move into another area with a mine, the process repeats itself until all of the units not in their attack position have either been struck by a mine and been destroyed, or turned back, or all the units are actually in their attack positions. A quick side note here. Before you declare all of your combat movement as complete, note that this is a point of no return. Once the first landmine is detonated, combat has begun, and all battles are happening simultaneously, meaning that you can't go back and change who's attacking where after the battle dice have started rolling. So this is a really good time to take a look around the board and make sure everything is how you want it before you move forward. After all combat moves are completed and everyone is in their attack positions, but still in Phase 3, it's time to officially declare all attacks. As for land units, any units that didn't move but are currently in their attack positions may now be declared as attackers. All land units that made combat moves to get into their attack positions must now be declared as attackers if able. Now it's time for the land units to pay the piper using the 151 rule that we talked about earlier. After you've sorted how many supplies you'll need to declare your attack, return them to the shared inventory, but save one of the spent supply tokens to use now as an attack arrow. Place it on the border between the attacking land units and the territory under attack, with the one supply side up and the arrow pointing in the direction of the attack. After a player has officially declared all of their attacks, the defender now chooses whether or not to detonate any landmines that may have been triggered on the mined borders that are being attacked. And, as we just talked about, any land units hit by mines are removed from the combat and remain in the territory opposite the mined border that they were trying to attack. You might have noticed that the back of the supply tokens / attack arrows say reroll 8+. Here's what that's about. When a power is declaring an attack on a single territory with land units from multiple territories simultaneously, some of the land units are making a flanking attack. Now, the units attacking from the territory that contains the highest number of attacking units is considered to be the main attack. Any other land forces attacking the same territory from different territories are making flanking attacks. In the case of a tie, the attacker chooses which is the main force. Flip the supply token / attack arrow of the flanking forces to the reroll 8+ side. Each land unit making a flanking attack must reroll all results of 8, 9, or 10 during the combat, including rerolled results. Now this bonus remains in effect throughout the combat, even if all of the units in the main attack have been turned back by landmines, retreated, or even been destroyed. This is a big deal, and you'll see why after we talk about the combat sequence. I think of the final round of landmine detonations as kind of a step 0 in Phase 4 because it kicks off the conduct combat phase, but in reality, it's the last part of Phase 3. Let's look at an example of a combat move phase that includes all the bits that we've covered so far. Now, as we go through this example, undoubtedly there would be other stuff on the map, but for clarity, we're only going to show pieces that are relevant to this specific example. And again, this is not a strategy video, and don't ask me how the board ended up this way, war is crazy. It's the UK's turn, and they've got the Axis on their back foot. They're planning an attack on Benghazi and to try to sink the mixed fleet in Sea Zone 30. But, as you might have noticed, the Axis have invested heavily in land and sea mines. The Brits have already advanced their convoys and requisitioned their reinforcements. Time for Phase 3 and the UK's combat move. Remember, all the units that want to move into battle this turn must start moving here. Now, because of the laws of physics, we're only going to be able to move one piece at a time, but in the game world, they're all moving at the same time. Also, each unit trying to enter combat this turn has to move into their attack position or engage with a mine. Let's start with sea units and I'll show you what I mean. The destroyer moved from Sea Zone 23 to 25. It has to pause there because there's a sea mine in the zone and the Germans get to decide if they want to detonate it before the destroyer moves on. But they don't have to make that choice until all of the UK's combat moves are locked in. So the UK continues by moving the battleship and the destroyer from 24 to 23. Again, a sea mine causes them to pause. The two destroyers and the sub in 31 move up to 30, and they're accompanied by a fighter from Cairo and the bomber from Cyprus. Now, all of the UK units are in their attack position and/or they're engaging sea mines in a sea zone. Now, the attacking units in 31 don't engage the enemy units there in Phase 3. We're only worried about sea mines right now. So, after all the combat moves are locked in, the Germans and the Italians will get to decide if the encroachment by this group of UKC units is enough to get them to pull the trigger. As we can see that the sub in 29 did not move. That means that no matter what happens with any of the sea mines, it will not be making a combat move this turn. Oh, and I put the German fighter on Crete to show that 1, German air units can land there, and 2, that they're not involved in any combat or movement around their island. Over to land combat. The Germans still have a flag waving over the otherwise abandoned Tobruk, but a max level force in Benghazi. The UK has 2 Sherman tanks in Mersa Matruh, 4 infantry and 4 Matilda tanks in Bir Hashim, plus 4 Spitfires on station in El Agela, all eager to get into the fight. Let's see how the UK plans to attack. Again, all the units that are going to make a combat move this turn have to do so now. The move will either put them in their attack position or it will engage them with a mine. So the 4 fighters in El Agela move into their attack position, which is in Benghazi. The 2 Sherman tanks move west to try to cross into Tobruk, but the Germans control the territory and there's a mine on the border, so the tanks will have to pause here. The units in Bir Hashim are already in their attack positions, so they don't need to do anything yet. That also means that the 2 mines on the border between Benghazi and Bir Hashim haven't yet been triggered. Oh, and the guy in El Agela is too far away to make a combat move that would put him into an attack position with an additional movement point necessary to declare that attack. Let's zoom out and look at all of the current combat moves. All of the units that were not already in their attack positions have moved in that direction. Air units have moved into the spaces that they plan to fire in. On land, the Shermans are trying to cross the border into Tobruk, but it has a landmine on it. At sea, all of the sea units have moved towards potential combat zones of 30 and 24, but they all just happen to have moved into sea zones with mines. How'd that happen? I don't know. Now here's that key point of no return that I mentioned earlier. It's at this point that I highly recommend taking another look around to make sure everything is where you want it. Once the enemy starts rolling for mines, all the combat moves become locked in and can't be changed later. So the Axis have a bunch of triggered mines that need deciding on. To go boom or not to go boom? I guess that's the question. They can do this in any order they want and one at a time, but they have to decide on all the mines in each instance before rolling for any of them. For example, the Axis have 2 sea mines in Sea Zone 30. They can't just roll one of the mines and see what happens. They've got to decide on how many, if any, that they're going to detonate. After talking it over, they decide to detonate the German mine, but hold off with the Italian mine for now. The German player rolls 1 die looking for a 3 or less to hit, and it hits. Of course, air units can't be hit by mines, so the UK needs to assign 1 hit to its sea units. They select one of the destroyers and remove it from play. The Germans also remove the spent sea mine token. The Germans are on a streak of 1 in a row, so they decide to jump over to Sea Zone 25 and try to sink the other destroyer. They roll and another hit. Ouch. Only one available target, so the destroyer sinks to the deep, and the Germans return the sea mine token to the shared Axis inventory. After seeing all the fun the Germans are having, the Italians decide to get in on the action. They choose to blow the sea mine in 23 to try to hit the battleship or the destroyer. They roll and a miss. The Italians remove the sea mine. Looking over the state of the sea units making combat moves, the units in 30 are in their attack positions, but the units in 23 are not. The battleship and the destroyer are going to need to move again towards combat until they either enter another sea zone with a sea mine, or they enter their attack position by entering a sea zone with enemy units. But they don't have to move until the enemy has made all of their decisions on all of the triggered landmines, and the results of any detonations have been resolved. That takes us back to dry land and the Shermans trying to move into Tobruk. The Germans have control of one mine on the border between Tobruk and Mersa Matruh, and 2 mines on the border between Tobruk and Bur Hashim. The Shermans are trying to cross the eastern border, so that's the mine that is triggered, and the southern mines are unaffected. The Germans roll 3 dice, looking for 3s or less. 1 hit. Remember, hits from landmines don't destroy the units that those hits are assigned to. Rather, they turn them away. These hits cause them to remain on the other side of the border that they were trying to cross, and they aren't in combat anymore, and they don't move during non-combat. Basically, they get a timeout for the rest of the turn. So, one of the Shermans is removed from the border and turned on its side for clarity. The Germans now remove the landmine, and the remaining Sherman advances into Tobruk. The Blitz ability allows that Sherman to immediately take control of the territory, including any mines and supplies in it. Zooming out again, we can see that with the arrival of the Sherman in Tobruk, all of our land units that needed to move to get into their attack positions have arrived. However, the battleship and the destroyer in 23 have not, and these are the only 2 units out there that still need to move. They can move into 24 or 15 to attack the units there, or into either 26 or 28 to engage with another sea mine. Or they could split up and execute any of those options alone. However, sea units can never enter the same sea zone twice during the same combat move phase. So the one thing this pair can't do is move back into sea zone 20. They decide to stay together and move through 25 into 28, daring the Italians to hit the button. The Italians decide to oblige them and detonate the mine. They roll and a hit. The UK has to assign a hit. They decide to take the first hit on a battleship. The Italian sea mine is removed, but the destroyer and the now damaged battleship are still not in their attack position. Again, they can move to 24 to engage the destroyer there, or move into the battle that's about to start in Sea Zone 30. With only 1 movement point left, any other move would be illegal. They must end the combat move phase either destroyed by mines, or in a sea zone with enemy units ready to do battle. They stay the course and move into 30. As they do, keep in mind that sea mines can detonate anytime new enemy sea units violate their waters, meaning the Italians once again have the option to detonate the sea mine in 30. Oh, and if sea mines go boom in this fashion, the attacker can only assign hits to the newly encroaching sea units. For example, the damaged battleship and the destroyer just moved into 30, joining the destroyer and the sub already there. The Italians decide that the time has come to detonate their mine. They roll, needing a 3 or less, and a hit. The hit must be assigned to either the damaged battleship or the incoming destroyer. The UK chooses the destroyer and removes it from play, and then the Italians remove the spent sea mine token. Again, zooming out, we can see that all the units looking for a fight are now in their attack positions, meaning it's now time for the UK to officially declare their attacks and consume the necessary supplies. Now, sea battles never require supplies, so we can focus on the battle in Benghazi. The 4 fighters and the Sherman that blitzed through Tobruk made combat moves to get into their attack positions, so they must attack. The 4 guys with the 4 Matildas in Bur Hashim didn't make a combat move, but are already in their attack positions, so they can now be added to the attacking forces. Time to sort out how many supplies are needed and consume them. Now, the fighters never need supplies, so they're good to go. The 8 units in Bur Hashim need 2 supplies to declare their attack. The first one for their first 5 units, and another for the second 3. They use 2 supplies from the adjacent Mermatru, removing one from play and using the other as an attack arrow pointing at their target. The Sherman needs 1 supply, so it uses the one it just took control of in Tobruk. The attack by the Sherman is the smaller of 2 forces of land units attacking the same territory, making it a flanking attack. The Germans use the supply token as an attack arrow, but with the 8+ reroll side face up. After the declaration of all of the attacks and the spending of the supplies comes the last possible round of mine detonations. There's 1 mine on the border between Tobruk and Benghazi, and 2 on the border between Benghazi and Bur Hashim. Because the Germans have control of Benghazi, the choice to detonate or not, and the order thereof, belongs to them. They decided to start by blowing up the mine on the Tobruk border. They roll 3 dice looking for 3s or less. No luck. The mine is removed and the Sherman is unaffected. Next, the Germans decide to blow both mines on the Berhashim border. The first one scores a hit, and the second scores 2 hits. Wow, okay. The UK must now select 3 units to remove from the fight. They select 3 of the 4 infantry units and move them to the back and on their sides to show that they're in their timeout for the rest of the turn. The Germans remove the 2 mine token as the UK swallows real hard and reconsiders their odds for success in this endeavor. Note here that because of the mine blast, the total number of units attacking from Berhashim is down to only 5. Now, when they had 8 units attacking, the UK had to spend 2 supplies to declare that attack. Do they get a refund? Negative. Those supplies are already spent. The results of mine detonations can never retroactively change how many supplies were needed to declare an attack. A few less notes about this example. The UKC units could have also attacked the units that are in the Benghazi convoy zone. We've got a better example for convoy zone combat coming up later, but keep an eye on those units just the same. Because Mursa Brega doesn't have any combat units in it, the UK units in Berhashim could have used the supply token there to cover their supply costs. Lastly, the truck in Cairo could not have loaded the infantry there and brought them into the fight. Trucks only move during non-combat. There's one, and only one, situation in the combat move phase where C units can make a move that doesn't have to result in combat or their destruction by a C mine, and here it is. If, at the start of the combat move phase, there are enemy C units in the same C zone as the active player can move those C units out of that C zone. They can move to a different C zone and start a fight there, engaging C mines along the way as normal, or they can move into a C zone with no enemy units and conduct no combat in the next phase. This situation of mixed C units can arise if C units are deployed into a C zone that already has enemy units in it, or if attacking C units decide to end the battle before all of the enemy units have been destroyed. More about that last bit when we get into C combat. Once all the combat moves, mines, attack declarations, and mines have been resolved, we officially move into Phase 4, Conduct Combat. Again, all these battles are happening simultaneously, but the attacker chooses the order that each battle is resolved, and each battle must be resolved completely and one at a time. No jumping around. And all declared attacks must conduct at least 1 round of combat. No chickening out now. There are really 3 different kinds of combat in this game. Land combat, sea combat, and combat that happens in numbered convoy zones. Now, they all use the same basic mechanics, but unique rules and the various units' special abilities make them different enough that it's worth discussing them differently. Let's get started with an overview of the combat sequence, and then we'll get back to that land combat in Benghazi. For my seasoned Axis and Allies players, most of this sequence is going to feel familiar, but there are some key differences here, so you're going to want to stick around. Step 1 of the combat sequence is issue combat orders. In this step, in sea combat, attacking and defending subs decide if they're going to submerge or surprise attack. In step 1 of land combat, any units with the air defense ability will fire before the very first round of combat. Attacking air units that are hit by the air defense will be removed from play. Then, defending combat land units decide if they're going to spend 1 supply token, regardless of the number of defending units, to stay and fight or attempt to retreat. Once all of that is sorted, we move to step 2. Here, attacking units fire. The attacking player will roll 1 die for each attacking unit. Each unit will score a hit if they roll their attack value or less. For example, fighters have an attack value of 4, so they'll score a hit on the roll of a 4 or less. For each hit rolled, the defender selects but does not remove 1 defending combat unit. These units are considered casualties, but they will get to shoot back. In step 3, the defending units fire back, even those assigned as casualties. As before, the defender rolls 1 die for each defending unit with a defense value, and they'll score a hit by rolling that defense value or less. Fighters have a defense value of 5, so they'll hit on the roll of a 5 or less. The attacker assigns any hits to their forces and removes them from play. In step 4, the defender removes any casualties sustained in step 2 and resolves any retreats. Step 5 is interesting. First, if there are no defending units remaining, skip step 5 and move on to step 6. If there are defending combat units remaining, the attacker chooses whether to press or cease the attack. Now, and this is really important, if they want to press the attack, they have to be able to provide enough supplies for all of the attacking units they wish to keep in the fight. Remember, land units haven't crossed into the enemy territory yet, so they can draw supplies from the territory that they're attacking from, or any adjacent territories that are friendly or neutral that have supplies in them. However, they don't have to send all of their attacking units back into the fight. The attacker may choose to only supply some of their attacking units and remove others. If they do, the unsupplied units are set away from the rest of the action, they don't participate in the rest of the battle, and they can't move during non-combat. If the attacker can't or chooses not to supply any of the attacking units, then the attack is over. So, in step 5, the attacker can end the attack and call a full retreat, Or, if they can supply them, they can send all of their attacking units back into the fight and start another round of combat. Or they can strategically choose to provide supplies to some of their attacking units, sending them into the fray, while holding some back. If the attacking player has access to the needed supplies and chooses to use them, the attacking player draws the necessary supplies from the board and returns them to the shared inventory. Leave the attack arrows where they are and start a new round of combat with step 1. In this second and any subsequent rounds of combat, the defending player will still have the option to retreat or spend supplies to defend as before. However, there are a number of units that have abilities like air defense that are only effective in that very first round of combat. Keep an eye out for those when starting the second round of combat. These can be easy to miss. If the attacker in a sea combat decides to cease the attack, the combat ends and the sea units stay in the same sea zone as the attacking enemy units. Attacking sea units that end an attack do not leave the zone. They end the turn in the same sea zone as the defending units. Now, any air units that are retreated from a sea combat also remain in the zone, but air units still have to find a safe place to land during the non-combat move phase or crash trying. Oh, and defending sea units can never retreat. That's a land territory thing only. So that's the basic idea. Again, I know that sounds like a lot, but once you get the flow, it does move pretty smoothly. A quick word about the defend retreat option in step 1. Defending a territory costs 1 supply token per round of combat regardless of the number of defenders, but retreating is free. If the defending units don't have access to the necessary supplies at the start of a round of combat, they must retreat. Retreating units may still be selected as casualties in Phase 2, but instead of firing back in Step 3, in Step 4, all of the defending units make a break for it to an adjacent friendly or neutral territory that hasn't been blitzed through or attacked by enemy land units. Retreating units will also need to respect the stacking limits of the territories that they're trying to retreat to. If there's more units than can fit in that territory, the retreating player selects which ones get in. Any units that didn't make the cut need to find someplace else to go or be destroyed. However, notice that air units, scout cars, and free French units all have an ability called self-sufficient. That means that they can defend for free. So there might be an instance where defending units are made of a mix of units that need supplies to defend and units that don't. In that case, the self-sufficient units can stay and fight, while the supply-dependent units seek safety in a neighboring territory. But those retreating units can still be selected as casualties on their way out of Dodge. Also note that because the air defense ability triggers before the first round of combat, these units fire for free in my imaginary Step 0, but can still retreat in Step 1. And only combat units can retreat. That means that trucks and supply tokens can never retreat. In the worst case scenario where all of the defending combat units need supplies and don't have them, and they don't have a place to retreat, they're all destroyed in Step 4. Okay, let's fast forward our game and see if we can make all this a bit clearer with a few examples. As we move into Phase 4, before anything else happens, the Italians' anti-aircraft artillery gets to use its air defense ability. For each unit with this ability, the defending player rolls 1 die for each attacking air unit to a max of 3 per unit with the air defense ability. In this case, there's 1 unit with air defense and 4 attacking air units, so the Italian player rolls 3 dice looking for a 2 or less and 1 hit. The UK player must now assign 1 hit to one of their air units. Naturally, it's one of the fighters, and it's immediately removed from play. Now that the air defense has been resolved, the Germans have to decide if they want to spend a supply token and stay and defend the territory, or retreat. They decide to stay and fight and grab a supply token from the neutral Mersa Brega. We'll talk about these later, but the bomber's collateral damage and the scout car's supply raider abilities resolve here after the AA guns have fired and after the defenders decide to retreat or spend a supply token to defend, but before any attack dice are rolled. Time for Step 2, attackers fire. Typically, players can do this in whatever order they want, but whatever order you choose, you'll usually roll all of the units that have the same attack power at the same time. However, a number of units have particular abilities or conditions that will cause them to be rolled separately. The Sherman coming from Tobruk is a good example. As its attack arrow suggests, any misses that it rolls that come up as an 8, 9, or 10 are re-rolled. So even if there are other units that have an attack value of 5, you'd still want to roll this one by itself so that you can tell if it needs to be re-rolled. So let's start by looking at that Sherman. It rolls needing a 5 or less to hit, and it misses. But it rolled a 9, so it gets to try again, and it misses again, but with an 8 this time. Third time's the charm? Apparently so. It scores a hit. Oh, and I'm putting the dice next to the units that I'm rolling just as part of the demonstration. Of course, you don't need to do this unless you just happen to have a lot of time on your hands. I don't judge. You paid for the game. You play it however you want. So the Sherman scored a hit. Now, the Axis players will be assigning these hits after all of the attacking units have fired. So all they have to do right now is keep track of the total number of hits. Time for the UK to roll for all of their units with an attack value of 4. That's the fighters and the Matildas. The fighters score 2 hits and the Matildas score 2 more. Finally, the UK infantry needs a 2 or less. A miss, but the damage is definitely done here. The Axis needs to assign 5 hits. They can select any of their combat units, but that will exclude that truck. Remember, trucks and supplies can never retreat or be taken as casualties. Now, the Axis players will need to agree which units are destroyed, or the UK player will get to decide. After firing with its air defense ability, the AA gun has no ability to fire, and the German infantry are better on the defense. So they decide to select the AA gun and 2 of the Italian infantry and 2 of the German infantry for a total of 5 casualties. But these infantry units will get to fire back, and here's their chance. Step 3, defenders fire. The 2 Italian infantry fire needing a 2 or less, 1 hit. The 4 German infantry fire needing a 3 or less, 1 more hit. The German tank needing a 4 or less pulls the trigger, a miss. Finally, the German fighters needing a 5 or less, 2 more hits. Now the UK has to select units to take the 4 Axis hits. They can't select the infantry and Berhashim that are in timeout, so they select the infantry and 3 of the 4 Matildas and remove them from play. Step 4, remove casualties and resolve retreats. No retreats here, but we do have some defender casualties and we remove them. Well, that changes things a bit. Time for step 5, press or cease the attack. The UK has 2 land units left, the Sherman and the Matilda. They're attacking from different territories, so they'll need 1 supply for each if they want to continue the fight. However, they also have 3 Spitfires, and they don't require any supplies to fight on. The UK decides to keep everyone in the fight. The Sherman and the Matilda break open the 5 supply token in Berhashim and remove 1 each to pay for their attack arrows. Something worth noting here. When the UK declared their attack earlier, the Sherman was determined to be the flanking attack because it was the smaller of the 2 forces attacking the same territory. Now that we're down to just the Matilda and the Sherman attacking, does the Sherman still get the flanking bonus? That's a good question, and the answer is yes. After units are declared as a flanking force, and no matter what happens to the main force over the course of the battle, flanking forces never lose that 8+ reroll flanking bonus. So the 8+ reroll attack arrow stays in place with that Sherman, and we start a new round of combat beginning with step 1. Now, even if the AA gun were still here, it wouldn't fire again. They only fire before the very first round of combat. That takes us to the defender's decision to stay and fight or to retreat. The Germans decide to dig in and spend 1 of their 2 remaining supply tokens. On to step 2. The Sherman fires and hits on its very first attempt. The fighter and the Matilda all fire needing a 4 or less, 1 hit. The Shermans select the 2 infantry for the casualties. Time for step 3 and the Germans to fire back. The 2 infantry fire and both miss. The tank needs a 4 or less and scores a hit. Now the fighters need a 5 or less, no joy. The UK needs to assign 1 hit and it goes to one of their fighters. They remove it from play. In step 4, the Germans remove their fallen. Step 5. Does the UK want to press the attack, give up the ghost, or somewhere in between? The Brits decide to keep everyone in the fight using 2 of their 3 remaining supplies. That takes us back to step 1. Let's look at the Germans' options here. A couple of things to note. First, air units do not require supplies to defend. Second, defending units may only retreat to an adjacent land territory that is friendly or neutral and has not come under attack by land units. Mersa seems to fit that bill. But this is not a territory that can be controlled, only occupied, so air units can't land there. That means that the German tank is the only unit that can meaningfully retreat from Benghazi. If the fighter declares a retreat, it's simply destroyed. No point in that. So what are the Germans' options here? They can spend that last token and keep the tank in place to defend with the fighters and hope to fend off the UK's attack. Or they could retreat the tank, let the UK units fire, assign any hits to the tank and the fighters, and then if the tank survived, it could retreat to Mersa. But this is their favorite truck, so they decide to stay and fight. Time for the UK to try to close it out. The Sherman fires and manages to roll one of the only 2 numbers that it misses on while flanking. The fighters and the Matilda fire only 1 hit. The Germans assign that hit to one of their fighters. The UK left the door open a little bit here. The Germans prepare to return fire. The tank fires and misses. The German fighters roll and 1 hit. The UK assigns that hit to a fighter and removes it from play. The Germans remove their fighter. Step 5. What can the UK do here? Well, they only have 1 supply token left, so they can end the fight, saving that last supply in Berhashim, and the Spitfire can go back to Eligela during non-combat. Or they can press the fight with the last Spitfire and either the Sherman or the Matilda, removing the other from combat. The UK also has to consider what the Germans can do. They are out of supplies, so the tank will be forced to retreat and the fighter forced to defend alone. The UK decides to go for it. They spend the last supply token in Berhashim and keep the Sherman in the fight, meaning the Matilda is no longer in the battle. We remove the attack arrow and now it is basically in the same state as the units that stumbled into those landmines earlier. It won't be able to fire or be fired at, and it cannot move during non-combat. With that, we head back to step 1. Now, the Germans are unable to spend a supply token to defend Benghazi, so the tank must retreat. We turn it around to show that it won't be firing in step 3, but it is not out of danger yet. It can still be taken as a casualty if the UK attacking units hit. Let's see how it goes. The Sherman fires and hits. The Spitfire makes its run and misses. The Germans have to assign 1 hit and they select the fighter. The fleeing tank won't get to fire in step 3, but the German fighter will, and it hits. Needing a land unit to be able to capture the territory and that shiny truck, the UK decides to lose its last fighter. Step 4. Time to remove casualties and resolve retreats. The Germans remove the fighter and the tank hightails it to Mersa Brega. Now, with no enemy combat units remaining in the territory, the UK skips step 5 and moves on to step 6 to conclude combat. Here, the victors move in all of the attacking land units that were part of the final round of combat up to the stacking limit of the newly captured territory. In this case, the UK only has the Sherman tank left, so the UK removes the attack arrow and moves into Benghazi. Now that the UK has finally got control of the territory, they switch out the German marker for their own. Next, they'll capture any trucks that were left behind. In this case, the UK will capture the German truck. More about trucks and their function in the game later, but for now, the truck is returned to the Germans' inventory and replaced with a UK truck. More bad news for the Axis. Benghazi is a port city. That means that when the Allies capture it, the corresponding convoy zone is closed. So we remove the German and Italian markers from C-Zone 15. Now, we don't replace them with the Allied markers. They don't take control of it. The zone is just closed. However, the units that are there stay there for now. If they're still there when the Germans' turn begins, the land units and supply tokens will be returned to the reinforcement zone and be sent out again during their deploy reinforcements phase. The fighter there will have the normal 2 moves to find a safe place to park during the advanced convoys phase. A few quick notes here before we move on to sea combat. Only combat land units, except for scout cars, can capture a territory. If the UK air unit would have been all that was left, the territory and the truck would have remained in German control, regardless of whether or not there were any combat units remaining to actually defend it. You must have a land unit in the territory at the end of combat to raise the flag. Also, you'll notice that we remove the Axis markers from the Benghazi convoy zone when the UK captured Benghazi. The same thing happens if the Allies capture Tripoli. Now, I would include Tunis in this list, but if Tunis falls, that's the ballgame. Now, the Axis can return the favor if they take Algiers, Oran, or Casablanca. If these convoy zone correlated port territories are liberated by either power, the markers are immediately returned and that convoy zone is reopened for business for both powers on the appropriate side right away. So if the Americans recapture Algiers from an overly aggressive German attack, they can deploy reinforcements to the Algiers convoy zone at the end of that same turn. So yeah, lots going on in that example, but it should give you a good idea of how to handle mines, supplies, retreating, how trucks and territories are captured, and what happens to a convoy zone when its port city is captured. That was also a good example of air combat. Now, let's head over to the Eastern Med for some sea combat and even more air combat. After running into nearly every sea mine in the Med during the combat move phase, the UK is attacking with a bomber, a fighter, a damaged battleship, and now 1 destroyer and a sub. The Axis are defending with a destroyer and 2 subs. Step 1. Because both sides are facing an enemy destroyer, none of the subs will act in step 1. That means no surprise attacks and no submerging. On to step 2. The attackers have 2 units that will hit on a 6 and 3 that will hit on a 4 or less. I like to arrange units into groups based on their attack and defense value to make it easier to keep track of. Also, it's worth noting that because the UK player has a destroyer, their air units will be able to hit the subs. If they didn't, the UK air units would need to be rolled separately because any hits from them would need to be assigned to non-sub units. So with their destroyer present, the UK player rolls for both the bomber and the battleship at the same time and gets 1 hit. The Germans note the hit. Now, the other 3 units roll looking for a 4 or less. 1 more hit. So 2 all day. The Axis players agree to select the destroyer and the German sub. By the way, again, that's the deal when multinational forces come under attack. The powers on the defense have to agree where to assign the incoming hits. If they can't, the attacker gets to choose, so work it out. And remember, casualties get to fire back. On to step 3. The Italian destroyer needs a 4 or less and a hit. Now, before we roll for the subs, notice that even with a destroyer on their side, subs cannot hit air units. Sub hits will always be assigned to sea units. The Axis roll for both subs needing a 2 or less and another hit. So the UK has to assign the hit from the destroyer to any of their units, but the sub hit has to go to a sea unit. They assign the destroyer hit to a fighter and the sub hit goes to their destroyer and they remove them from play. Step 4, the Axis remove their sub and the destroyer. Step 5, does the UK want to continue the attack or call it a day? If they call it quits, their sea units will end the turn in the sea zone with the Italian sub, but the bomber will move as normal during non-combat. If they decide to press the attack, neither side has a destroyer, so both subs will have their abilities back. They'll get the option to surprise attack or submerge in Step 1, and they cannot be hit by air units. The UK decides to press the attack. Step 1, we've got 2 subs that must choose to surprise attack or submerge before any dice are rolled, and the attacker must choose first. The UK decides to use their surprise attack. Now, if the Italians decide to submerge, they'll be immediately removed from the rest of the battle. They can't fire or be fired at, and in this case, it would also end the battle. But where's the fun in that? So they also decide to surprise attack. Still in Step 1, the UK rolls first, needing a 4 and misses. The Italians roll, needing a 2 or less, and they hit. Now, again, still in Step 1 here, the UK must assign the hit to a sea unit. If they assign it to the sub, it would be removed from play, but any hits that it scored in this round would still count. If they assign it to the battleship, that would be its second hit, so it would be removed and would not be firing before it sinks below the waves. Basically, surprise attack hits from subs are first strike hits, but they aren't targeted hits. The other player gets to decide which sea units to assign them to. Naturally, the UK player chooses to take the one hit on the sub and removes it from play. Now we move to Step 2. The bomber doesn't have a legal target, so there's no need to roll for it. The battleship rolls looking for a 6 or less and hits. The Italians take the sub as a casualty. As we move into Step 3, notice that the sub already fired in this round of combat and cannot fire again. So in Step 4, it is removed from play. With no enemy forces remaining, we skip Step 5. In Step 6, we conclude combat, well, by doing nothing. There's nothing to do in sea combat in Step 6. Now that all the UK combats are resolved, we move into the non-combat move phase. Here, players must find a place for air units that survive combat to land, and they may move any unit that did not make a combat move this turn except for that truck. Trucks can't move on the turn that they're captured. Also, land units can't move into territories that are enemy occupied or controlled, and sea units can't make a non-combat move into sea zones that are hostile, except for... You just knew there was going to be an exception, right? Submarines have that treat hostile sea zones as friendly thing, so they can make a non-combat move through sea zones with enemy sea units other than destroyers. If they enter a sea zone with an enemy destroyer, they don't do combat, but they do have to end their turn there. Now, because of the way the game is structured, it's impossible for a land unit to trigger a landmine during non-combat, but the same is not true for sea units. They can make a non-combat move into a sea zone with an enemy sea mine. If they do, they resolve them in the same way that they did during the combat move phase, and if it survives and still has moves left, it can sail on. If a sub moves into a sea zone with an enemy destroyer and a sea mine, it has to stay put even if it survives the mine. Back to our example. In any Axis and Allies game, I like to start my non-combat moves by resolving air units. So the UK bomber needs to find a place to land. It has a total of 6 moves, and it's used one of them to get off the island and into Sea Zone 30. Its long range gives it 3 possible landing zones, and none of them are Benghazi or Tobruk. Both of those territories were captured this turn, so they can't land there. It can go back to Cyprus, it can land in Cairo, or it can use all of its movements and get all the way to El Agheila. It takes the long flight and heads out to El Agheila. The only UK sea unit that can move is the sub in 29 because it made no combat move. It decides to slip between the mines and the destroyer to prepare to attack the Axis convoy zones on their next turn. The UK battleship has had a full day. It remains damaged and on its side until it can make it back to the shipyard in Sea Zone 31. If it's there during the Requisition reinforcements phase, the UK player can spend a supply token from Cairo to bring it back to Bristol fashion. As for the land units, the Brits have taken Benghazi, but it is looking pretty thin. The infantry in Bir Hashim and the Sherman in Mersa Matruh all hit mines, so they can't move. Plus, the Matilda in Bir Hashim was engaged in the battle for Benghazi, so it's stuck. Time for the UK truck to come to the rescue. We've got a full explanation of how trucks work and an example that'll go into more detail, but for now, trucks can carry up to 6 units of cargo. Each supply token and each land unit is 1 unit of cargo. They can pick up cargo along the way, but offload only once. They also have an ability called Coast Road Movement. Units with this ability that start in a territory that is part of the Coast Road can move up to 5 territories per turn, but only during the non-combat phase and only as long as they stay on that road. So the UK breaks open that 5 supply token and loads up the truck in Cairo with 3 supply tokens and 3 infantry and heads west to Benghazi. The last guy in Cairo doesn't want to be left out, so he starts the long walk to the front. The only other land unit that the UK can move here is the infantry that's in El Agheila, but he thinks it's better to stay put and guard the bomber. With all the non-combat moves settled, the guys in Burhashim and the Sherman in Mersa Matruh are released from the penalty box and are ready for action on their next turn. Now that you've got a solid understanding of land and sea combat and how air units can zip in and out of either one of them, it's time to talk about combat in convoy zones. A few things to know right away. This game doesn't have transport ships. Well, none that are represented by physical pieces. They're virtual transports. Now, by themselves, these virtual transports and any cargo that they're carrying don't make a sea zone hostile. So if they're alone in a convoy zone, enemy sea units can sail past them in the combat or non-combat move phases. Each virtual transport can carry up to 2 units worth of cargo. No matter the type, each land unit counts as 1 unit of cargo. But in convoy zones, and only in convoy zones, any number up to 5 supply tokens is the equivalent of 1 unit of cargo. 6 supply tokens would be 2 units of cargo, but they aren't divided 3 and 3. The first unit of cargo would be 5 supply tokens, and the second unit of cargo would be 1 supply token. Yeah, this is a really key point, and it only applies to supplies when they're on these virtual transports in convoy zones. But understanding this correctly will make a big difference in the game. So again, 1 to 5 supply tokens in a convoy zone equals 1 cargo unit. 6 to 10 is a second cargo unit. Hold on to that. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the 151 rule works here as well. 1 to 5 supplies equals 1 cargo unit. 151. Cool. Back to the map. The Algiers convoy zone is a hop in place and the Germans want to get in on the party. They've got 2 subs and 2 fighters in range. The Allies have a bunch of American land units and a 5 supply token that got deployed at the end of their turn. The UK has 3 supply tokens that they also deployed at the end of their turn. The zone has an American destroyer that ended its last turn in the sea zone and the UK fighter that's been assigned as a convoy escort on the UK's turn. So the US destroyer and the UK fighter are both in the sea zone and defending the virtual transports. The Germans make their combat move. They move the 2 subs in along with the 2 fighters from Tunis. Fighters have a movement value of 4. These German fighters use 2 moves to get to the fight, so if they survive, they'll have 2 moves left to find a safe place to land. The Germans declare this as their only attack this turn, and we move into Phase 4, Conduct Combat. Okay, the defenders have a destroyer in this fight, so the attacking subs don't attack in Step 1, and the UK fighter will be able to hit them. So, Step 2. The subs and the fighter both need a 4 or less to hit, but the subs can't hit the air units, so they'll need to be rolled separately from the fighters. The subs roll and get 1 hit. The fighters roll and both miss. The Allies must now assign the sub hit to a C unit. Now, big, really important thing here. Transports cannot be selected as casualties if there are any other valid targets for incoming hits to be assigned to. The purpose of sea and air units in convoy zones is to defend the transports and help their cargo reach the land safely. So again, you cannot take a hit on a transport if that hit can go anywhere else. That means that in our example, the sub hit must be assigned to the destroyer. Over to Step 3, Defenders Fire. Now, the guys on the transports might be yelling about what's happening in the sea zones around them, but that's all they'll be doing. Land units, including AA guns, are just cargo. They do not fire back. So that leaves the destroyer needing a 4 and hitting, and the fighter needing a 5 and also hitting. So the Germans must assign 2 hits, and because of the destroyer, they can take them on the subs or the fighters. Now, the smart move here is probably to take both the hits on the subs, but in the interest of our example, we're going to take 1 on the sub and the second one on the fighter and remove them both. Step 4, the defending destroyer is removed. Now, the defending player may remove 2 units worth of cargo from the battle. Basically, while all the fighting was going on, one of the transports escaped from the battle. They're still in the same sea zone, but they're just like a submerged sub. They don't go anywhere, but they can't be hit. So you can just move them away from the other units or turn them on their side to show which have been selected as the designated survivors. These can be any 2 units worth of cargo in the zone, and they don't have to belong to the same power. Also, remember the whole 151 thing. All the land units count as 1 unit of cargo, but 1 to 5 supply tokens count as 1 unit's worth of cargo. 151. Boy, that is handy. The Allies decide to designate the tank and one of the artillery as the escapees. We move them aside. On to Step 5. The Germans need to decide if they're going to press the attack or cease hostilities. There are just too many juicy targets left here to leave now, so they press the attack. Back to Step 1. Without the defending destroyer, the sub decides to use its surprise attack and fire in Step 1 rather than submerge. Not that it matters here, the only valid target for the subs are the virtual transports, and they have no attack or defense values, so they never shoot back. But still, with no enemy destroyers present, subs always fire in step 1. They need a 4, and they hit. Now this is probably the part of the game that I had the hardest time wrapping my brain around. Here's how it works. When assigning any hit to a virtual transport in a convoy zone, try not to think about it in terms of how many transports may or may not be present or got hit or whatever. Instead, just look at the cargo units themselves. When assigning any kind of hit to cargo, first, the defending player chooses a unit's worth of cargo and removes it from play. In our case, the Americans remove an infantry, taking them down from 4 to 3. Now, the attacking player selects a cargo unit type. They can say infantry, tank, artillery, supply, whatever. Presumably, it'll be a cargo unit type that's in play on the defense. Then, the defending player must choose a cargo unit of that type and remove it from play. So here, the Germans say supply. The Allies must now remove a cargo unit's worth of supply, so 5. If they had fewer than 5, they would remove however many they did have. Now, the supplies don't all have to come from the same power, so the Americans break up their 5 supply token and then remove 3 UK supply tokens and 2 of their own. We can also remove the UK marker that we were using to distinguish the now destroyed supplies. So because it was a sub-hit, that all happened in step 1. Step 2. The German fighter needs a 4 and hits. The UK fighter is their only valid target, so it's done for. But it does fire back in step 3, needing a 5 or less, and it misses. Step 4, the fighter is removed and the Allies get to escape 2 more units of cargo. This time, they take the last artillery as the first unit of cargo, and they select the 3 remaining American supply tokens as the second unit of cargo. Quick side note from the FAQs. If a player decides to escape supply, they must escape 5 of them. They can only escape less than 5 if that's all that remains. Let's get back to our example and see if the Germans want to retreat. Not so much. Back to step 1. Now, at this point, it's just shooting fish in a barrel, but they do actually have to shoot them. Undefended transports are not auto-destroyed like they are in most Axis and Allies games. The sub fires in step 1 and hits. The defender picks a unit to lose. All that's left are infantry, so the Americans remove one of them. The Germans select another infantry. Again, that was a sub in step 1, so now the German fighter gets to take a free shot on the goal and they miss, meaning that in step 4, the last American infantry escapes to the sea with its compatriots. And that is the end of combat. Yes, the sub and the fighter end the conduct combat phase in the convoy zone. Now we move on to non-combat. The surviving Allied units return to their normal place in the convoy zone, and the German fighter has to find a friendly place to land. Note that these American cargo units aren't entering the convoy zone. So if an Axis sea mine were here, it wouldn't be triggered. And the German subs still hanging around in the sea zone will have to wait until their next turn to attack again. The same cannot be said for the Italian naval and air units that are in range. So unless the UK does something to defend them on their turn, the Italians will get a free shot at these cargo units before they advance to Algiers in phase 1 of the Americans' turn. So these guys are not out of the frying pan just yet. Now you've got the basics for the 3 types of engagement in this game: land combat, sea combat, and convoy zone combat. They've got a lot in common, but understanding their subtleties is likely to be the difference between victory and defeat. After all the non-combat moves have been completed, we come to phase 6, deploy reinforcements and assign convoy escorts. I suggest starting with the second part first. Any air units that did not make a combat or non-combat move this turn may now be assigned as convoy escorts. They can move up to 2 spaces to one of their open convoy zones. Air units assigned as convoy escorts will defend the sea zone if it comes under attack. If they survive any of those attacks, they'll remain there until phase 1 of their next turn, when they'll have 2 moves to find a safe place to land. Now for the first part. During the deploy reinforcements phase, players must move the items that they purchased earlier in the turn from the reinforcement zone to their staging areas up to their stacking limits, or into their open convoy zones, even if those convoy zones are hostile. They can also move units and supplies from their staging areas to the open convoy zones. Any air units deployed into convoy zones are also considered to be on convoy escort duty and will defend the zone if attacked. Remember, sea units can only be deployed in sea zones with that sea unit silhouette that are specific to their power. Supply tokens cannot be broken down from the 5 supply tokens to single supply tokens until they reach a staging area or a convoy zone. So if you bought a 5 supply token for 3 RPs, you'll have to send it out that way, but you can break it up once it gets to wherever it's going. If you want to deploy 3 supply tokens to one place and 2 to another, you'll need to purchase 5 single supply tokens for the full price of 5 RPs. To avoid confusion, when deploying supply tokens into a shared convoy zone, they should be stacked on the emblem of the country who bought them so everyone can know on whose turn they'll be advancing to that port city. Now, very important, enemy sea mines are triggered when land units and/or supply tokens are deployed into a convoy zone where an enemy sea mine is present. They will detonate at the controller's discretion just as they did in our earlier example. However, here, and this is the most important part, hits from sea mines cannot be assigned to sea units or cargo that are already in the convoy zone. That means that hits from sea mines and convoy zones that are detonated during this phase will only ever hit newly arriving transports. When they do, you'll follow the same procedure for assigning hits that we used before. So yeah, with a little luck, well-placed sea mines can be crippling. Like everyone else, the UK can deploy to any of their open numbered convoy zones, but they have some additional restrictions. Other than during setup, the UK can never deploy anything directly to the Suez Canal or Indian Ocean convoy zones. Anything that wants to advance into Cairo or into Zone 31 must be deployed into the Atlantic Ocean convoy zone. On subsequent turns, anything deployed there will advance into the Indian Ocean and then the Suez Canal convoy zones before finally advancing to Cairo or into Zone 31. We talked about all things Malta earlier, but as a reminder, the UK can only deploy air units, supplies, and AA guns to the Malta convoy zone. Because the Americans don't have a staging area, if somehow they don't have any open convoy zones in this phase, any and all of their purchases in the reinforcement zone are destroyed. Now, a special note for both of the Axis players. They can deploy AA guns, air units, and anti-tank units directly to Sicily, Sardinia, and Crete from the reinforcement zone or from Italy. However, while air units can fly away from those islands later, I hope the AA guns and the anti-tank guns really like it there because they'll be spending the rest of the war on those islands. After deployment, the turn ends and the action moves to the next country in the order of play in the top right corner of the map. If that turn is the end of a round, that's the end of Italy's turn for rounds 1 through 6, and the US's turn for rounds 7 through 13, move the round track marker forward 1 and continue play until round 14 is finished or an instant victory has been achieved by either side. Remember, instant victory is achieved by eliminating all combat units of the opposing side in North African land territories, the Axis capturing Cairo or the Allies capturing Tunis. Check page 6 of the rulebook to determine the winner after round 14 if the instant victory conditions are not met. We've talked a lot about the Rommel's last push scenario, but it might be helpful to quickly recap the specifics before we discuss the Operation Torch scenario. Rommel's last push starts the game in round 1 and has 4 milestones in rounds 1, 4, 7, and 8. Because the US doesn't enter the game until round 7 in this scenario, Rommel's last push is best for 2 to 3 players. In round 1, the scenario begins by restricting the Axis powers to 1 truck each. The Italians start with 1 in play, and the Germans start with 1 in their supply. Other than the Vichy French that start in West Africa, no units from either side may enter any of the land territories west of the white line bordering Meath. That takes us to our next milestone. In round 4, the US Lend-Lease program comes into play. During the UK's deploy reinforcements phase in round 4, place 2 UK Sherman tanks in the Atlantic Ocean convoy zone with whatever else the UK might want to deploy there. The Shermans will advance with the convoys as normal, meaning that they will land in Cairo in round 7. These are the only Sherman tanks the UK will ever have. They can't buy any more of them, and the US can't send them anymore. In the Rommel's last push scenario, round 7 is really the big one. The arrival of the Americans in round 7 is really the beginning of the historical Operation Torch, but there are some big differences between what happens in round 7 in Rommel's last push and the actual Operation Torch scenario in this game. Careful not to confuse the two. Let's take a look. There's a lot happening here in round 7 of Rommel's last push. We're going to add a bunch of units to the board, but first there are 2 items that are important but don't immediately affect the map. First, the second Axis trucks are added to their available inventory and can be purchased by them this round. Second, the Americans are not allowed to requisition air units in round 7. They can buy anything else, but no fighters and no bombers. The rest happens west of the Meath line. We can see this all written out if we turn our hymnals to page 28, but here's what it looks like after all of the adjustments. Let's walk through them quickly. The Germans put control markers in Tunis and the Kasserine Pass, while the Italians take control of Meath. 3 supply tokens are also added to Tunis. Both Axis powers place control markers in the Tunis convoy zone. The convoy zone is now open and units can be deployed there this round by either Axis power. However, even though they have taken control of these 3 territories in the region, the Axis powers are still not allowed to park air units or move any land units into any territory west of the Meath line. But starting in round 7, the Allies can. So the Axis players are going to want to watch out for any possible end runs by a sneaky Allied player. The Allied forces that have arrived in Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers represent the historical Operation Torch. They're performing a one-time joint amphibious landing on the U.S. player's turn. Casablanca and Oran are U.S.-only landings, but the battle in Algiers also includes 3 U.K. infantry units. This battle in Algiers will be the only instance in this game when two powers will be able to attack together. While the UK troops are placed in Algiers at the beginning of round 7, they are not allowed to act in any way until the US player's turn, and all 3 battles are forced attacks on the Vichy French units that are in these territories. The US and the UK have all made their combat move and the attacks have been declared, so they can't wander off and try to attack anything else. Notice that each of these territories have a number of supplies and 1 attack arrow. That attack arrow is paying for the first round of combat by these attacking units. So, for clarity, the 6 attackers in Algiers used 2 supply tokens to attack. 1 has already been discarded, the other is the attack arrow, so this attack is ready to go as is. As normal, all of these battles are resolved one at a time and in the order chosen by the attacker. However, unlike normal, the Vichy French may not retreat and the Allied units may not cease the attack. The Allies must continue to press the attack with all of the units in the territory, and additional rounds of combat must be paid for with supplies as normal. Each of these battles will continue until either all the Vichy French units are destroyed, all the Allied units are destroyed, or the Vichy French have a round of combat where they score no hits. If that happens, the surviving Vichy French in that territory lay down their arms, switch sides, and become Free French. The battle ends and they break out the wine. Moving forward, the Free French units are controlled by the US player. They move and attack with the Americans. As a bonus, if the Allies control Oran and Oran isn't already at its stacking limit, the US may requisition and pay for 1 of each type of French unit per turn and deploy them directly into Oran in Phase 2. So that's fun. As each of the territories are captured by the Allied Operation Torch forces, the Americans will place control markers in Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers and collect the relevant RPs on their turn. But both powers will place markers in their corresponding convoy zones. Moving forward, both powers can deploy to any of these zones. Now, the setup of the game gives the Allies pretty good odds of destroying or turning all of the French units, but as we know, wherever there are dice involved, anything can happen. So, if an Allied attack against those Vichy French units fails, the French units in that territory remain loyal to the Axis and are owned by the German player. Now, Vichy French units can never move or attack or be requisitioned, so they aren't really controlled by anyone. Still, if an Axis combat land unit ends the non-combat move phase in a territory occupied by Vichy French, they can take control of it. In contrast, the Allies would have to attack the territory and try to defeat them or turn them like they did in round 7. A few last notes about the round 7 milestone in Rommel's last push, and this one only applies in round 7. If the Americans control Casablanca, and thusly the Casablanca convoy zone, they must deploy all of their reinforcements there. If they don't control Casablanca, they can deploy into Oran and or the Algiers convoy zones. Now, if by some freak occurrence the Americans don't have any open convoy zones during their deploy reinforcements phase, first, clearly something's gone horribly wrong, and whatever they have in the reinforcement zone is destroyed. In subsequent rounds, the Americans can deploy to any convoy zone that's open to them that they wish, and they can buy air units. The last milestone in Rommel's last push is in round 8. Here the US can start finally purchasing air units, and the Axis powers can start moving units and supplies into the territories west of the Mareth Line. They can advance convoys, move units from Tripoli and Nalit west, and they can start landing air units in any territories that they control. Operation Torch skips rounds 1 through 6 and instead begins the game in round 7 with the arrival of the Americans. This scenario is obviously quite a bit shorter than Rommel's last push and is better suited for games with 4 players. This scenario is also what's used in tournament play with some modifications. You can find a link to all of the current tournament rules in the description below. When setting up the Operation Torch scenario, make sure everyone is using the same side of the setup cards. Yep, that's me, my bad. Sorry. With just a few minutes of placing pieces, you should be able to go from this to this. Ooh. Ah. Notice that the UK already has the 2 Lend-Lease Shermans staged in the Suez Canal convoy zone. Again, these are the only 2 Shermans that the UK will ever have, so treat them accordingly. The Indian and Atlantic Ocean convoy zones are still filled with the 12 RPs worth of variable placement combat units, each of the UK players choosing, but same as before, these can't be trucks, mines, or supplies. There are a number of rules that only apply in round 7 of the Operation Torch scenario. Normally, each round would begin with the Germans. In this scenario, the Germans are skipped in round 7, and the game instead starts with the UK's turn. The UK units in Algiers can't act until the US player's turn. The US may not purchase any air units in round 7, but may start purchasing them in round 8. In round 7, the Italians may only deploy units into the Tripoli convoy zone. When the action gets to the Americans, they will attack the Vichy French in Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers with all the same rules that we discussed in Rommel's last push. If the US controls Casablanca during deploy reinforcements in round 7, they must deploy all of their reinforcements into the Casablanca convoy zone. Lastly, notice that the victory conditions for the Operation Torch scenario are not the same as they are for Rommel's last push. The instant win conditions are the same, but if the game goes the distance, the conditions change depending on the scenario. Before we break down the special abilities of the various units, let's talk about stacking limits. The rulebook has the various details about stacking limits on all of these pages, so I thought it would be helpful to bring them all together in one section that covers how stacking limits apply and don't at the different times. Let's start with when they don't. First, let's remember that sea zones do not have stacking limits. So that means that there is no limit to the number of units that can be in a convoy zone on or off of virtual transports. Trucks and supply tokens never count towards the stacking limit of any territory. Units that are moving through a territory to get somewhere else, like tanks moving from one place to another, don't count towards the stacking limits of a territory that they're passing through, but will count when they come to a stop at the end of any phase. When air units are attacking or moving to or from a fight, they're considered in the air, so they don't count towards the stacking limits at the end of phases 3 or 4, but they do get counted when they land at the end of non-combat or when moving from a convoy zone in phase 1. Next, in land territories, the default stacking limit is 8 units, and the territories that vary from that baseline have the letters SL with a number listed under the name of the territory. For example, Tobruk has a stacking limit of 10, while Tunis has a max of 13. Italy and Gibraltar are staging areas, but Italy can hold up to 8 units, while Gibraltar can only hold 2. So Gibraltar can have a pile of supplies and trucks, but only 2 combat units. Note that Malta is a special case that we discussed earlier. Let's walk through the phases and point out times when stacking limits do count. Phase 1. You can't advance land units or park air units in a port city beyond the stacking limit of that territory. Phase 2. Well, nothing moves here, so you're good. Phase 3, on the other hand, land units will be moving into their attack positions. Units might move through overstacked spaces to get into attack position, but no territory can end this phase over its stacking limit. In Phase 4, at the end of any battle, regardless of the total number of triumphant attacking units, the attacking player chooses which of the victorious units to move into the captured territory, but they cannot exceed the stacking limit of the newly captured space. This means that it's impossible for there to be a violation of the stacking limits at the end of Phase 4. Phase 5. At the end of the non-combat move phase, all stacking limits must comply with the posted placards. Any move that would fail to meet those restrictions are prohibited. If the attacker has any air units that cannot find a territory that was friendly at the start of the turn and is not over its stacking limit within its remaining range, is destroyed. Lastly, Phase 6. As we mentioned, convoy zones have no stacking limits, but staging areas do, and they must be respected in this phase. Any allied units that can't be placed in a staging area must be placed into a convoy zone. If the Axis staging area is full, they also have the ability to deploy AA guns, air units, and anti-tank guns directly into Sicily, Sardinia, and Crete. So basically, you can't make a move that would leave a territory over its stacking limit at the end of a phase. But accidents happen. If a player should happen to accidentally end a phase with more units in a territory than is permitted, here's what you do. The opposing player chooses combat units in the overstacked territory to move out of the space. While these have to be legal non-combat moves, they are almost certainly not going to be moves that the violating player is going to like. If there are no legal moves to be made by any of the units in the violating territory, the controlling player removes units of their choosing until the stacking limit is met. One last note about stacking limits, and this is part rules and part strategy. I find that stacking limits becomes the most relevant when trying to capture Cairo. You can see that Cairo has a stacking limit of 13, and the only adjacent territory is Mersa Matruh, and it can only stack 8 units. So that means that there will never be more than 8 land units attacking Cairo. Now, I can hear you thinking, Gary, I've got a bunch of German tanks and scout cars that can cruise into and through Mersa Matruh and join in the fun with the other 8 land units that are already there. Sorry, not so much. Land units end the combat move phase in the territory that they're attacking from. And Mersa Matruh can't hold more than 8 units. Now, the Axis can send in as many air units as can reach as long as they've got a place to land, and they can set up 1-2 punches where the Italians attack first and the Germans try to finish them off. But no phase can end with more than 8 combat land units in Mersa Matruh, so act accordingly. Now that you know the basics for all three types of combat and the details regarding each scenario, it's time to dive into the pile of special abilities for the different units. Let's start with a quick recap of the ones that we've already discussed. 2 units are up first. We had an example earlier that covered all of the various sub-abilities and how they're cancelled by the presence of enemy destroyers, but real quick. In Step 1, subs decide to submerge and remove themselves from combat, or to use their surprise attack and make a first strike attack that immediately removes any sea unit destroyed by that hit. Subs can never hit air units, they can't be hit by air units, they don't make sea zones hostile, meaning that they can't block enemy movement, and they can treat hostile sea zones as friendly. Oh, and the German subs are cooler than all the rest. They deploy immediately into Sea Zone 1 when purchased in Phase 2, and they can make combat moves in the same turn. Very nasty. However, if an enemy destroyer is present at the beginning of a round of combat, subs do not act in Step 1, they can be hit by enemy air units, and a sub loses the ability to treat hostile sea zones as friendly. The UK can build battleships, and those battleships take 2 hits to sink. If they're damaged, they don't lose any abilities, but they do not heal at the end of the round. To repair, they have to make it to the shipyard in Sea Zone 31. During the Requisition Reinforcements phase, the UK player can spend 1 supply from Cairo to repair the damaged battleship. It can repair in Phase 2 and still make a combat move in Step 3. Air units in this game are the most straightforward. Fighters for all the powers have the same basic stats, and no special power of any sort, well, other than being able to attack and defend without needing supplies. I suppose that's pretty special. Bombers, however, they have an ability called collateral damage. If players attack a land territory with 1 or more bombers, and any of those bombers survive any of the air defense rolls, the attacker may remove 1, and only 1, supply token before any combat dice are rolled. Now, this ability does not replace the normal attack of the bomber, and kicks in only after the defending player has decided to retreat or has spent the supply token that they need to stay and fight. Remember that using this effect doesn't replace the combat rolls of the bombers, but it can never work in sea zones, only in land territories. Like the other bombers, the German Stuka bomber has the collateral damage ability, but they can't fly as far or hit as hard as the other bombers. However, German bombers have their own very powerful ability called targeted attacks. When attacking land territories, German bombers are rolled separately, and when they score a hit, the attacking player names a combat land unit type, so no trucks or air units, and the defending player must assign that hit to a unit of that type. In sea combat, it's basically the same thing. The German bomber is rolled separately, and the German player names a sea unit type for each hit scored. They can only name subs if they've got a destroyer present at the start of the round of combat, but they can also call out transports if they're attacking a convoy zone. Any hits to transports are assigned in the normal way. And the German Stuka targeting ability is the gift that just keeps on hurting. German bombers maintain this ability round after round after round. Oh, and the Germans can build 4 of them, so yeah, this ability can be devastating. Time to talk land unit special abilities. There is a lot to cover here. Some of the types of land units have the same abilities regardless of their controller. Others have abilities that are unique to them. So we're going to talk about the abilities rather than the units themselves, and I'll show which units they apply to until we get to AA guns, trucks, and scout cars. We're going to talk about each of those separately. Here goes. Self-sufficient. Units with this ability can defend without needing a supply token. Like other units, they can retreat if they want to, but if they stay and fight, they don't need a supply. This can lead to situations where units that require supplies retreat, while self-sufficient units remain and fight it out. Next, an ability unique to artillery. Support infantry and mechanized infantry. When an artillery unit and an infantry or a mech is attacking the same territory, each artillery increases the attack value of 1 infantry or 1 mech to 3. The key here is that it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Each artillery gives a +1 to the attack value of 1 infantry or 1 mech, not all of them. However, while the infantry or mech getting the buff from the artillery must be attacking the same territory, they can be attacking from 2 different territories. So that's cool. Coast Road Movement. This one is fun. Any unit with this ability that didn't make a combat move and starts the non-combat move phase in a coast road territory can move up to 5 spaces, but they must stay on the coast road for the whole move. And of course, non-combat moves can never move into a hostile territory. Oh, and remember that the coast road is that long red line that runs the length of the map, except for Spanish Morocco. Well, it does go through Spanish Morocco, but the territory is impassable, so everyone's got to go around. Not cool, man. Blitzing. Tanks can make a combat move through a hostile but unoccupied territory, take control of that territory and any enemy trucks that are there, and then make a second combat move. The second move can be back to where it came from, or into a territory that is neutral or friendly. If the first move ends with a tank in an attack position, it can use its final movement point to declare an attack into an adjacent enemy occupied territory and do battle. However, it will need to be supplied from the territory that it is attacking from, or an adjacent friendly or neutral territory. Mechanized infantry gain this ability if they start the combat move phase in the same territory with a tank with the Blitzing ability. Again, this is a 1-to-1 ratio. A tank with the Blitzing ability can give that Blitzing ability to one mech. If a tank while blitzing with a mech is turned back by a landmine, the mech doesn't lose the ability and may continue on, assuming that the mech wasn't also caught in the blast. The German anti-tank guns are just plain nasty. They've got the same air defense ability that all AA guns have, and we're going to cover them next. But I want to tell you about the other ability that all anti-tank guns share: targeted fire tanks. In the very first round of combat in each battle, and only the first round, while attacking or defending, anti-tank guns are rolled separately. The player controlling the anti-tank guns has the option of requiring the opposing player to assign any hits scored by the anti-tank guns to a tank. In subsequent rounds, though, the anti-tank gun fires like any other unit. As promised, let's talk about anti-aircraft artillery, or AAA, or AA guns, or whatever you want to call them. They have no attack or defense value. They'll never fire during steps 2 or 3, and they'll never move during the combat move phase, but they can be taken as casualties during combat. If they're attacked by land units and they're alone, they're automatically destroyed, but they do occupy a territory, so they will stop a blitzing tank or a mech in a pinch. If an AA gun is alone and attacked by only air units, the AA gun does get to fire first, and at least one of those attacking air units has to survive in order to destroy the naked AA gun. That all sounds pretty bad, but here's why they can be a big deal. They have the air defense ability, and this ability can dramatically change the course of a battle before it even really begins. Here's how it works. Units with the air defense ability only trigger when they're in a land territory that comes under attack by any combination of units that includes fighters or bombers. When that happens, those units will fire in what I call Step 0, basically before Step 1 in the very first round of combat. Units with the air defense ability only fire once in that Step 0, and they'll hit on the roll of a 1 or a 2. Each hit scored is assigned by the attacking player to an attacking air unit, and it is immediately removed from play. Any downed air units will not fire in Step 2 because they've already crashed. Now, very important, each attacking air unit can only be fired at once, and each unit with the air defense ability can only fire at 3 air units each. So, if the defenders have 1 AA gun and the attacker has 2 air units attacking, the defender would roll 2 dice. If there were 4 attacking air units facing 1 unit with air defense, they would roll 3 dice. They would need a second unit with the air defense ability to be able to fire at any more than 3 attacking air units. Scout cars have a ton of abilities that give them lots of versatility. Let's start with the ones that we know. They can use the coast road to make the speedy moves during non-combat, and they are self-sufficient. Is that all? You mean the other 2, 3, 4, 5 abilities that scout cars have are unique to them? Wow. Okay. Let's start with an overview. Scout cars are the only units that can enter Sahara Desert territory, so that's cool. Scout cars are lightweight, long-range land vehicles that can only strafe hostile territories. As such, they're the only land units that can move during the combat and non-combat move phases. They can destroy supply tokens, and their attacks can target air units, but they can never take control of a territory. Let's break these abilities down. Hit and run. When attacking, scout cars do not require supplies, but they must retreat after the first round of combat. This is why they can never take control of a territory, but they can still be selected as casualties in that first round of combat. As for long-range patrol, because scout cars retreat after that first round of combat, they can move during the non-combat move phase. They can use any remaining movement points to move to a neutral or friendly territory. When scout cars attack, they have 2 optional abilities that they can use. They can act as a supply raider, and before rolling any dice, destroy 1 supply token in a hostile or neutral territory. This ability is in addition to their normal attack, and during that attack, they can choose to use their targeted attacks air units ability. This is exactly what it sounds like. When attacking, a scout car rolls separately, and if it hits, the attacker can force the defender to assign that hit to an air unit. Basically, a scout car can roar into a territory, knock over a supply barrel, cruise out to the airfield, take a shot at some planes, and then run for their lives. Because after they fired in Step 2, every unit in the territory is going to be firing back in Step 3. We've got an example coming up in a minute that'll demonstrate all of that, but first, let's talk trucks. Now, it might be hard to believe, but the success or failure in the North Africa campaign by either side will probably come down to trucks. Trucks are basically land transports with a lot of the same functionality, but with some key differences. First, trucks do not count towards stacking limits in a territory. They have the Coast Road ability, which is good because, not being combat units, they will never be part of a retreat and they will never move during combat. So they'll never enter enemy-controlled or occupied territories. When in a territory that comes under attack, trucks cannot be selected as a casualty. The only exception to this is when trucks are carried as cargo in convoy zones. Then they can be selected as a casualty. Otherwise, they can never be destroyed, only captured. During the non-combat move phase, trucks can move supplies and some types of land units. Each truck has a max cargo capacity of 6. Now, unlike when they're in the convoy zones, each individual supply counts as 1 unit of cargo. So when on a truck, a 5 supply token would count as 5 units of cargo. Trucks can also move these types of land units: infantry, artillery, anti-tank guns, and AA guns. Basically anything that doesn't have an engine of its own. To be loaded on a truck as cargo, the land units must belong to the same power as the truck. No hitchhiking on your buddy's truck. And land units cannot move or make any other action before being loaded on the truck or after being unloaded. Traveling by truck as cargo is the only action that land units can take in a turn. Now, trucks can pick up cargo anywhere along their path while moving, but can only unload once, and unloading ends their turn. Now, each side captures trucks differently. The difference might seem subtle, but it definitely matters. When the Allies capture an Axis truck, the Axis truck is returned to the appropriate Axis player's inventory, and a truck piece belonging to the capturing power is put into play in the same territory. The Allied player swaps it out for a truck of their own, and the Axis player can requisition that truck on a future turn. If no Allied truck pieces are available to replace the Axis truck, the truck is instead destroyed and returned to the Axis inventory. Now, if the Axis captures an Allied truck, rather than trading out the pieces, the Allied truck remains in play, but the relevant player's control marker is placed underneath it. So the Allies not only lose control of the truck, and the Axis have gained access to an additional truck, but the Allies are now down a truck in their inventory. And considering the Axis powers only have access to 1 truck in rounds 1 through 6, and only 2 in rounds 7 through 14, grabbing the keys to an extra truck for the Axis will make a huge difference. However, captured trucks belonging to any power cannot move during the new controller's non-combat phase on the turn that it was captured. Time for one last example. Here we're going to focus on trucks, scout cars, bombers, AA guns, and anti-tank guns. Let's jump in. It's time for the UK's non-combat phase, and they need to shore up Benghazi and prepare for an attack by the sizable force amassing in El Agheila. With the 2 trucks that they have in play, they can get nearly every supply and unit in position to do just that. The truck in Tobruk is looking at a busy day. They've started the turn on the coast road, so as long as they stay on that road, they can move up to 5 spaces. The truck heads east through Mersa Matruh and into Cairo. There, it loads up the infantry and the 2 supply tokens. On its way back through Mersa Matruh, it picks up the AA gun and a 3rd supply. It moves into Tobruk and picks up the artillery, reaching its capacity. Then it moves into Benghazi and offloads, ending its turn. The truck in yellow isn't on the coast road, so it only has 2 moves. It grabs the infantry and the anti-tank gun, moves forward into Mersa Brega to scoop up as many supplies as it can carry. Trucks can carry 6 units of cargo total, so they break up the 5 supply token into singles and load up 4 of the supply tokens. Unfortunately, they will leave 1 supply token behind as they move into Benghazi. That supply is now available to be used by any force in an adjacent territory, or any truck in range can swing by and pick it up. But before that truck moves into Benghazi, we've got to keep an eye on the stacking limits. Remember, trucks and supply tokens don't count. So Benghazi currently has 7 units, and we're trying to move 2 more units in. Normally, the stacking limit for a land territory is 8, but printed on the map, we can see that Benghazi has an SL, or stacking limit, of 10. So the truck is cleared to enter. Not wanting to be left out of the party, the Sherman in Cairo uses its Coast Road ability to make it an even 10 in Benghazi. With all their non-combat moves complete, the UK would do whatever needed doing in Phase 6, and I'm sure the Italians would want to do something here, but we're going to jump ahead to the Germans' turn. We're also going to assume that they've advanced their convoys and made some brilliant purchase. That brings us to the German combat move phase. For the purposes of this example, I'm going to cheat a little bit and add 2 UK trucks and a supply token to Tobruk. Oh, and you're also going to see some of the pieces or land units or whatever move out into sea zones. Of course, they aren't actually moving out there. This is just for clarity. And I think that you're going to find yourself doing the same thing in your games. How you do this is not really that big of a deal as long as everyone knows what's going on. Time for the German combat move. I like starting with air units. So the Germans are moving into Benghazi with a fighter and 2 Stuka bombers. Next, the scout cars have 3 movement points each and they are ready to do their thing. The scout car in Sahara Desert Space I is going to move through Halo and into its attack position in Bur Hashim. The scout car passing through the space with the undefended truck doesn't interrupt its movement, but it also doesn't capture the truck. Now, the UK truck in Bur Hashim, on the other hand, will be captured at the end of the phase because the scout car is going to end the combat move phase in the same territory with it. One of the scout cars moves through Mersa Brega, joining the other scout car in Bur Hashim in attack position. The last scout car from El Agela uses 1 movement point to move into attack position in Mersa Brega. The 2 German tanks and the mechanized infantry move into Mersa Brega, and that wraps up all of the combat moves. Something worth noting here, the scout car that's back in Tripoli has the range to reach Mersa Brega, but it wouldn't have the remaining movement point it would need to declare an attack, so it can't attack this turn. The same thing is true about the German tank Insider. It can reach Mersa Brega, but it can't declare an attack, so both of these units will only be able to move during the non-combat move phase. Now, I can see you looking at that shiny UK truck in Halo and wondering why the Germans aren't using a guy from Zilla to capture it. Trucks are not combat units. They don't make a territory hostile, so moving into that territory would be a non-combat move, meaning we'll get to that. Okay, so the Germans are ready to lock in their combat moves and declare their attacks. The air units and the units in Mersa Brega are all attacking Benghazi, but the scout cars in Bur Hashim are splitting up, one to Benghazi and the other to Tobruk. Air units and scout cars never need supplies, but we still need attack arrows for the scout cars in Benghazi, so we grab 2 from the supply and place them accordingly. You'll notice that the scout car attacking Benghazi is the smaller of the 2 forces attacking the same territory, so it gains the flanking bonus. Very sneaky. The Germans still need to provide a supply for the 2 tanks in the mech in Mersa Brega. They're attacking 1 territory with 5 or fewer units that need to be supplied for 1 round of combat. 151. They'll need 1 supply. They can use the 1 supply token that they just rolled up on, but they decide to break open the 5 supply token in El Agela and grab 1 from there. With all the attacks declared and paid for, it's time to check for mines. The UK has 2 mines that have been triggered by attack declarations, one on the border between Mersa Brega and Benghazi, and the other between Bur Hashim and Benghazi. They opt to detonate the mine on the Mersa Brega border. They roll 3 dice looking for a 3 or less. No luck. The mine is removed. The UK then decides to hold off blowing the mine on the Bur Hashim border. With that, we come to the end of Phase 3. The scout cars that have stopped their movement in the same territory as an undefended truck now capture it. When the Axis captures an Allied truck, rather than removing it, they place a control marker under it, and if they still control it on their next turn, they'll be able to use it as if it was their own. And with that, we officially move from Phase 3 to Phase 4. The first thing we need to do here is resolve the air defense ability. The UK has 2 units in Benghazi with the air defense ability, and the Germans are attacking with 3 air units. Remember, each air defense unit can fire at a maximum of 3 air units. Attacking air units, though, can only be fired at once by units with the air defense, so the UK only rolls 3 dice here. If the Germans had come with 1, 2, 4, 5, or 6 air units, the UK would have rolled that many dice, up to 3 for each unit with the air defense ability. If the Germans had come with 7 air units, the UK air defense units would have rolled 6 dice, up to 3 for each unit with the air defense ability. So the UK rolls 3 dice looking for a 2 or less, and they score 1 hit. The Germans select the fighter and remove it from play. Now that air defense has been resolved, the UK must decide if they want to retreat or spend a supply token to defend Benghazi. Normally, combat land and air units would be able to retreat to Tobruk, but it would have meant leaving the trucks and the supplies behind, but they could have done it. However, because Tobruk is under attack by land units, that sneaky scout car, retreat to Tobruk is now impossible, so the UK must defend. On the upside, they can grab the supply from Tobruk before the German scout car has a chance to destroy it. Okay, air defense has been resolved, and the defender has decided whether or not to fight, and they have spent the supply token to pay for that defense. Now the Germans have to decide if they want to use the collateral damage and supply raider abilities of the bomber and scout cars respectively. Each ability gives the Germans the option to destroy a supply token in this target territory before rolling any dice. That's 1 supply token for collateral damage and 1 supply for the supply raider abilities. In both instances, it doesn't matter how many of the specific unit type is attacking. It's always just 1 supply if 1 or more bombers make it through the air defense, and just 1 supply if 1 or more scout cars make it through the minefields. The Germans decide to use both abilities and force the UK to remove 2 supply tokens from Benghazi. Oh, and those lost supplies have to come from the territory that's under attack. Defenders can't grab them from neighboring territories. time for the attackers to roll. Now, the Germans have two types of units that have targeted attack abilities, meaning that these will need to be rolled separately from the other units of the same attack value. I suggest always rolling for these units first so that you don't forget. The Germans roll for their bombers with the targeted attack combat land units ability. Now, their bombers need a 5 or less to hit, and they get 2 hits. Now, they can't target the air units or the trucks, so they tell the UK player to assign 1 hit to a tank and the other to an anti-tank gun. The only UK tank is one of their Precious Sherman tanks. They move it and their only anti-tank gun to the side to show them as casualties. Next, the scout cars have the option to use their target air units, and one of them is flanking. The scout car in Mersa missed. The scout car coming from Burhashim rolled an 8, meaning that it can re-roll. On the re-roll, it scores a hit, and the Germans opt to use their target air units ability. The UK must assign this hit to an air unit of their choosing. They select the bomber and move it back with the other casualties. Something to keep in mind here, targeted attacks by any unit are not first strike abilities. Any unit selected as a casualty due to a targeted attack will get to fire back in step 3. But the Germans aren't done firing yet. The mech fires needing a 2 or less, no joy. The tanks fire needing a 5 or less, 2 hits. The UK selects the 2 AA guns and prepares to fire back. They've got one unit that has a targeted ability, the anti-tank gun. As the name suggests, it can target tanks, but only in the very first round of combat. Again, I suggest looking for these kinds of units in your forces and rolling for them first. The anti-tank gun defends on a 3 or less, and it hits. The Germans must now assign a hit to a tank. Seeing as these tanks have already fired, it can be removed from play. Next, the UK Spitfires roll looking for a 5 or less, 1 hit. The Sherman fires and misses. The artillery and the 2 infantry all defended a 3 or less. They roll and, whoa, they miss badly. So badly, in fact, that the Brits are now wishing that they would have opted to try to fend the Germans off from Tobruk rather than Benghazi. In Tobruk, those land units rolling 9s and 10s would be re-rolling. Alas, not so much. The UK bomber fires needing the loneliest number and nothing. The UK only scored 1 non-targeted hit. Now, even though the 2 scout cars are in the same territory, the Germans can't select the scout car that was attacking Tobruk. So, because the scout car was going to be forced to retreat after the first round of combat anyway, they select the scout car from Burhashim and remove it from play. Step 4, remove casualties and resolve retreats. No retreats, but plenty of casualties. Off they go. Step 5, press or cease the attack. Well, the 2 scout cars don't really have an option, so they're removed from combat along with their respective attack arrows. That leaves the Germans with a tank, a mech, and 2 bombers. The bombers don't need supplies, and unlike the anti-tank gun, their target land units ability is very much still active. That leaves the tank and the mech that need supplies if they're going to continue the fight. They grab another supply from Eligela and press on. That takes us back to step 1. No air defense, no mines, no collateral damage, no scout cars this time, and if the anti-tank gun were still here, it would just be firing non-targeted. The UK is still faced with a do-or-die situation, so they spend another of their dwindling supply tokens to defend. Step 2, the German bombers open fire and get 1 hit. They call out an artillery unit, and the UK selects it as a casualty. The mech fires and misses. The tank scores a hit. That's 1 non-targeted hit. The UK selects an infantry and prepares to fire back. The Spitfires score 1 hit. The infantry and the artillery score 1 more. 2 hits for the Germans to assign. They select a mech and a bomber. Step 5. The Germans are satisfied for now. They opt to end the attack. They remove the attack arrow pointing at the now burning Benghazi, and assuming that this is their only attack on the map, they move to the non-combat move phase. The bomber cruises back to Eligela. Ah yes, the Germans don't want to forget that shiny truck in Halo. They send 1 infantry to Halo to hotwire that truck. Now, they want to stack Mersa in hopes of taking Benghazi easily next turn. The scout car and the tank both use the Coast Road ability to get to Mersa. Now, they both had enough movement points to get there without that ability, but it's still a nice drive. The 2 infantry in Eligela and the 3 remaining in Zela make their way into Mersa, but now this area is overcrowded. Mersa can only hold 8 units, and the Germans are trying to pack in 9. The good news is that the scout car that came from Eligela still has 1 movement point left, so it can scoot over to Burhashim, leaving Mersa right as the rain it will never see. Finally, the German truck loads up the 3 remaining supply tokens in Eligela and brings them over. And as the non-combat phase ends, the German infantry takes control of that truck in Halo. Even though the Germans started with fewer units attacking than the UK had on defense, the various special abilities of the attacking units made it a very successful attack for the Germans. They spent 2 supply tokens and lost 4 units, while the UK lost 7 units and 4 supply tokens. Congratulations, you made it. You now have everything you need to know to play Axis and Allies North Africa. Once you get a good handle on all of that and you're ready for more, check out page 38 for loads of optional rules. If you're interested in learning more about those optional rules or strategies for this game, drop a note in the comments. If enough people request it, we might make videos about those topics as well. We had the great pleasure of being at Gen Con 2024 to capture the action of the final match in the very first Axis and Allies North Africa tournament. That event was hosted by Greg Smorey, and the game itself was managed by the game's designer, the one and only Matt Hyra. We're working on a video that will include a full blow-by-blow of that fantastic game, and when that's ready, you can find it at BoardGameNation.com and linked in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video, now's a great time to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a citizen of Board Game Nation by clicking the join button below to gain access to our exclusive content and giveaways. Thank you to our friends at Renegade Game Studios for publishing this game and sponsoring this video. A big thank you to Matt Hyra for all of his help with this script. To learn more about Renegade's complete line of Axis and Allies games and so much more, follow the link in the description to see all that they have to offer. When the North Africa Tournament final from Gen Con is ready, it'll be right here. The unboxing video should be in this general vicinity. For our latest bit of mayhem, right this way. And if you're ready for more from Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.